Well, good morning. Before we get started, I want to express my condolences to Congresswoman Debbie Dingell on the loss of her husband, John. John was a dear friend and mentor to me and many members of this committee. His passion for oversight, accountability, legislative process, and his lifetime of public service is an example to all of us. His passing is a great loss to our nation, to Congress, and this committee, which he loved so much. John, may you rest in peace. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Communication and Technology's hearing on protecting consumers in competition and examination of the T-Mobile-Sprint merger. This hearing is noteworthy because the last time a merger hearing was had before this subcommittee was almost 9 years ago. And in that time, there have been numerous mergers within this subcommittee's jurisdiction that have gone without a hearing. I believe it's the duty of this subcommittee to allow our members to publicly discuss and debate the merits of these transactions and to question the relevant stakeholders. The merger before us today is between two of our country's national wireless providers, T-Mobile and Sprint. These companies have acted as disruptors, competitors, and low-cost options in the wireless marketplace. T-Mobile's Un-carrier strategy has ended anti-consumer practices such as data caps, restrictive contracts, and much more. They have also worked hard to build a robust national network that by some accounts is the fastest in the nation. For its part, Sprint has been a leader in roaming agreements for rural providers and wholesale access for prepaid and lifeline providers. Sprint has worked hard to bring its networks to within 1% of Verizon's in terms of network reliability, or so their commercials say so. Consumers have also benefited from Sprint positioning itself as the best value. They are offering a plan right now where new customers can get a year of free service when they switch from another carrier, which sounds amazing. However, this hearing isn't about the benefits that both of your companies have brought to the market. It's about the extraordinary impact that your combined company could have on the public and the marketplace if this merger goes through. We will hear today from the Communication Workers of America, from the Rural Wireless Association, and Public Knowledge. They claim that this merger will have negative impacts on low-income consumers, rural providers, and jobs in the wireless industry. CWA's testimony suggests that this merger will result in up to 30,000 job losses in the industry and a reduction in industry pay by as much as $3,000 per employee. The Rural Broadband Association's testimony argues that rural consumers will pay more. They claim that Sprint charges 20 times less than T-Mobile or other national carriers for roaming agreements. These agreements allow customers of rural carriers who build their own networks in the most rural communities to use their phones throughout the country. What guarantees do rural providers have that they won't face increased cost if T-Mobile doesn't adopt Sprint's practices? And Public Knowledge's testimony states that consumer prices will go up due to the reduction in the number of national carriers from 4 to 3. They argue that the merger would hit low-income consumers the hardest because the number of carriers offering wholesale access would drop from 3 to 2. Sprint, AT&T, and T-Mobile sell access to their networks to prepaid and lifeline providers, who then sell that service under their own brands. What remedy do these carriers or their customers have if the new T-Mobile decides it wants to get out of the wholesale business or drastically raise rates? To that end, the FCC found in their Communications Marketplace report that the wireless market concentration was currently at 3,100 HHI. HHI measures how competitive a market is, with a higher number meaning it's less competitive. The Justice Department's horizontal merger guidelines state that a market with an HHI above 2,500 is highly concentrated. So we really aren't starting from a great spot. An increase of 200 points would raise significant concerns about competition. This merger is expected to result in a market power increase of 280 points for the postpaid market and 2,014 points for the prepaid market. That would take the prepaid market from where it is right now at 2467, which is just under DOJ's threshold, to 4481, a level that raises lots of red flags. These kinds of numbers have historically resulted in higher prices for consumers, less competition, and less innovation. Now, I appreciate both executives' statement that they believe that this merger will benefit consumers and result in lower prices, and their commitments to an accelerated deployment of 5G and the promises of expanded rural broadband. These are national objectives that are important to me and many members of this committee. However, I've seen a lot of mergers in this industry and others, and it's hard to think of one where consolidation didn't result in people losing their jobs, prices going up, and innovation being stifled. I look forward to hearing from the testimony from our two telephone companies that wish to merge and from the other panelists. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I could just take a point of personal privilege also to express my deepest sympathies to our friend and colleague, Debbie Dingell, on the loss of Chairman Dingell. And the chairman loved this committee. You know, this room is named after him. And I had the privilege of getting to know him in my days, not only on this committee, but when I first got to Congress. Again, he loved this committee, he loved this House, but most of all, he loved his district, the state of Michigan, and all that he did for it. So with that, I wish the Dingells my deepest sympathies on the loss of the chairman. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for convening our panel of witnesses today, and to our witnesses, thanks very much for being here. We appreciate your time. I look forward to hearing your expertise and different perspectives as we discuss the future of the telecommunications marketplace and learn more about the proposed merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. With any talk of merger comes a long list of potential benefits and drawbacks, and this one is no different. I understand from the CEOs of T-Mobile and Sprint who are with us today that there are many pro-consumer outcomes possible if the merger is approved. These potential benefits range from providing mobile broadband to millions of unserved and underserved Americans living in rural areas to helping the United States win the global competitiveness race to 5G. But I also understand from several of the witnesses representing groups here today that the combined company could pose some harm to consumers. Some of the potential drawbacks include the possibility to eliminate jobs or increase the price that consumers pay for access to wireless service. Our role in this committee is not to weigh the merits of these arguments and determine if this merger is in the public interest. Congress gave that road to the FCC, who along with the DOJ performs a more traditional antitrust assessment on the merger, and these two agencies will ultimately determine if the merger is going to be approved. Our role in the subcommittee is to provide policies that advance the telecommunications market, including expanding access to broadband to all Americans. One way to do this, especially for rural America, in many areas in my district, is to build 5G networks. In areas where the broadband is not currently deployed, 5G networks can help connect Americans to high-speed internet for the very first time. And in areas where broadband is already available, 5G networks provide a competitive alternative. This proposed merger reportedly will promote these objectives, and I look forward to hearing more about the ways in which the companies plan on doing that. But I also am interested in hearing from all of our witnesses today. This will be an enlightening discussion. The final decision about whether it's this proposed merger on these two companies is in the public interest is up to the FCC. Again, I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today and your testimony and the responses to our questions. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Today is our first hearing since the loss of our chairman, John Dingell. It's fitting that this room is named the John Dingell Room. After all, over 28 years as the top Democrat on this committee and over his nearly 60 years in the House, he fought to ensure the committee maintained its broad jurisdiction, had deliberative debates, followed regular order, conducted robust oversight, and produced legislation in the public interest. And in keeping with John's tradition, today we focus our microscope on the proposed merger of two of the four large nationwide wireless phone carriers, T-Mobile and Sprint, Collectively, these companies directly employ more than 80,000 people and serve more than 130 million customers. These companies are no stranger to merger discussions. In 2011, a struggling T-Mobile was almost purchased by AT&T, but was blocked by the Obama administration, and T-Mobile nevertheless went on to flourish. T-Mobile and Sprint attempted to merge 2 years later, but abandoned the deal after competition concerns were raised by regulators. Now, once more, the parties are seeking approval to merge. This hearing marks the first time in 8 years that the committee has met to evaluate the consequences of a merger. For too long, the House and this committee paid little attention to that responsibility, but now we resume the practice of reviewing major acquisitions so we can fulfill our obligation for the people to determine how this proposed consolidation will affect consumers, workers, public safety, and network resiliency, competition, and future innovation. For the last 8 years, major industry consolidation occurred without significant oversight, and the consequences of that have been borne by consumers and hardworking Americans. In the past, we've seen mergers jack up consumer prices, cut away meaningful choices, and outsource, undercut, and eviscerate good-paying jobs. We've seen previous merger conditions that weren't met or weren't enforced. We've seen the public interest in all its forms undermined, and that's why we must look carefully at these issues before a merger is approved. In this case, the transaction is currently being reviewed by the FCC, as well as the Department of Justice. As part of our oversight responsibility, we must make sure that the FCC is carefully reviewing the facts and keeping consumers' best interests in mind when deciding the fate of the merger. And I know we're going to have many hard questions today because the facts surrounding this merger are so much in dispute. For example, Mr. Ledger says that new T-Mobile won't raise consumer prices, but others say his company's filings acknowledge consumers could see price hikes, some argue by up to 15%, with the merger being particularly hard on the poorest consumers. How can we be sure that consumers who can least afford to pay more are not harmed by the merger? T-Mobile filed a letter committing not to raise prices with the FCC. Putting aside whether that's sufficient, there's a serious question as to whether the Trump FCC would be willing to impose any conditions in a merger order. Mr. Ledger says that the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint will be a net job creator on day one. But the Communication Workers of America say we should expect a loss of 30,000 jobs. The truth will have long-term implications for American families across the country. And Mr. Ledger says that new T-Mobile will create a world-class 5G network. But opponents say that both T-Mobile and Sprint have committed to investors to deploying 5G networks as separate and independent companies. 5G deployment is important, obviously, and valuable to consumers in the economy, and whether the merger expedites 5G rollout merits consideration. And Mr. Ledger also says that the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint will help new T-Mobile compete with AT&T and Verizon, all while new entrants and cable companies begin to compete in wireless. But smaller carriers worry the merger might snuff out existing and new competitive players that rely on wholesale access to T-Mobile and Sprint's networks. To this end, we must understand not only how the merger affects the current wireless marketplace, but also the marketplace of the future. And finally, Mr. Ledger says that the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint will help new T-Mobile build out robust rural broadband, while others argue that new T-Mobile will shut down 25,000 cell towers across the country. And I'd like to understand whether this is accurate and whether it will have a negative effect on the resiliency of the wireless network during disasters. So, Mr. Chairman, there are a lot of conflicting opinions on the impact of this merger, which is why this hearing is so important, and I hope that members will get the straight answers here today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as you all have said, I know we all have the Dingell family in our thoughts and our prayers on this difficult week. John Dingell taught us all how to be legislators. He was a legend in many respects. And nobody, despite everybody's attempt, has ever been able to do the yes or no questioning as effectively as Mr. Dingell did. We've all tried to emulate that, and so he is missed. He will never be forgotten, and I'm glad we're all honoring his life, his work, his service, and remembering Debbie in our prayers. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to echo my colleagues' warm welcome to all of our witnesses today and to thank you all for making the time to come share your thoughts with the subcommittee. We've generally avoided hearings focused on specific transactions in an effort to allow the regulators who are actually responsible for assessing them to do their work as much as possible, free from intense political influence. It's been my hope that experts at the FCC and the Department of Justice, who as we speak are reviewing this transaction and its potential impact on public interest and competition, will continue their analysis without undue political pressure. Now, in a district like mine, which would stretch from the Atlantic to Ohio, it's a district that gives new meaning to the word rural. We have coverage gaps that engulf huge areas of the map in places with as few as one person for every square mile. For Americans in some of these areas who have been awaiting the promise of broadband for far too long, with the connectivity, educational, and economic empowerment it brings, any news on this front is great news for celebration. So we've been appreciative of T-Mobile's rapid build-out efforts in Central Oregon and as a result of its newly acquired 600 megahertz licenses. With this committee's bipartisan work last year to keep the repack on track, with an additional $1 billion for reimbursement of broadcasters' moving expenses, more and more districts are realizing the benefits of groundbreaking incentive auction that we made possible through the action of this committee. The hope is finally becoming a reality in many of our areas of the country, and I think it's well worth noting T-Mobile's efforts so far in delivering on its promises, and in some cases ahead of schedule. Turning to the particular transaction at issues today. Experts, including some of our witnesses, are painting some very different pictures of the potential effects of this proposed merger. Going forward, we do want to see consumers paying less and getting more data. We want to see more choices, and we want to see intensified competition in the wireless and in-home broadband markets. We want to see faster rural development, and we want to see better service. And we need America to lead in the global race on 5G deployment, reaping economic benefits and transformative services for all Americans. As we consider the testimony of our witnesses, we need to take a holistic view instead of focusing on a particular metric like those who insist the government must intervene to preserve 4 nationwide wireless operators at all costs. We have to consider scale and operational efficiencies in that equation and the rapidly changing characteristics of the wireless marketplace, especially the convergence of functionality with non-traditional competitors such as global and satellite operators. With almost 50% of digital video now consumed on smartphones, wireless service is not what it once was. And with the advent of 5G, the capabilities are evolving at an exponential rate. So it's important for us as legislators to adjust our expectations to this new reality and resist the call for artificial market constraints that may not make any sense in a 5G world. I look forward to the witnesses today and their perspectives on each of these issues, and I want us to be the world's fastest and best 5G ecosystem, secure, affordable, and accessible to every American. With that, I'd yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long.
Thank you. I'd like to take a point of personal privilege here for just a minute, too. Maybe stop the clock for me for a second, if we could. On John Dingle, two plane loads of us loaded up yesterday morning out at Andrews to attend John's funeral in Dearborn, and we circled Detroit for about an hour after an hour delay here, and we're told we had 5 minutes of fuel left, or we could go to Pittsburgh and refuel and go back, and we'd miss the funeral. So I know that Anna Eshu was on that flight. Mr. Walden, that just yielded to me, who was chairman and now ranking member of the committee, Chairman Upton, who was committee ENC and had his office across from John for years. He and John Lewis, who's a legend in his own time, were supposed to speak at the funeral, and Speaker Pelosi happened to be on the same flight, or I happened to be on the same plane with them. And so at 30,000 feet, John Lewis led us in a tribute, and we had our own service for John Dingle at 30,000 feet yesterday, and it was quite moving. Chairman Upton spoke, Speaker Pelosi, John led us in prayer and spoke, and it was a pretty moving tribute. So we did what we did to get to Big John's funeral. I was born in 1955. John Dingle was sworn into Congress in 1955. He followed his father. His wife, Debbie, of course, follows him today. She's doing an excellent job, and thoughts and prayers go out to Debbie and the family. With that, I'll start my minute that Greg yielded to me. Today's hearing gives us the opportunity to hear about how the American public can benefit from the proposed merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. The U.S. telecommunications market has changed dramatically in recent years. In order to foster innovation and growth in any industry, it is important that we ensure that there is fair and competitive marketplace. I'm excited to hear how the third and fourth largest wire carriers in the United States plan to combine their spectrum resources to deliver a more robust nationwide wireless broadband network for consumers, drive innovation and investment, and better compete with the top 2 wireless providers. Investments in next-generation broadband networks are important to reach unserved communities like mine in southwest Missouri and help close the digital divide. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the new T-Mobile drive for innovation will help close that digital divide, benefit the U.S. economy, and provide consumers with more choices at lower cost. And I'd like to submit for the record 2 documents, an op-ed from the Missouri Times written by the head of the Missouri Farm Bureau demonstrating support for the merger in Missouri, and also a letter in support of the merger to the FCC from myself and several of my colleagues. And with that, I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back, but I just want to say for the record, we have another subcommittee hearing going on important health issues upstairs, so some of us will have to go up and back. But again, thank you for being here.
I thank the ranking member. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written and opening statements shall be made part of the record. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. First, we'll have Mr. Marcelo Clawray, Executive Chairman of Sprint Corporation. Next, Mr. John Ledger, Chief Executive Officer and President of T-Mobile US. Next, Mr. Chris Shelton, President of the Communication Workers of America. Then we'll have Ms. Carrie Bennett, General Counsel of the Rural Wireless Association. Mr. Doug Brake, thank you, Doug, Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And last but not least, Mr. Philip Barronbrook, Senior Policy Counsel with Public Knowledge. I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. But before we begin, I want to explain our lighting system. In front of you, of the witnesses, is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. And please wrap up your testimony at that point. The light turns red when your time has expired. Mr. Clawray, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Before we begin, I want to pay my respect to Chairman Dingell and his long-standing service to this country. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I would like to take the opportunity to explain why Sprint's proposed merger with T-Mobile will be great for the American consumers, will be great for Sprint employees, and will be great for our country. I'll go into details in a moment, but before I do so, I want to tell you a little about me. First, I'm an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States as a young man from Bolivia. I had very little money. I went to a small university in Boston, and I received a priceless education. Second, I'm an entrepreneur. After I graduated college, I founded a company called Brightstar. I started selling phones out of my car, and I gradually grew Brightstar into the largest mobile phone distribution and supply chain services company in the world. We worked very hard and grew over $10 billion in sales and thousands of employees. I'm most proud that we made Brightstar the largest Hispanic-owned business in the history of our country. In 2014, I sold Brightstar to SoftBank. Immediately after that, I became Sprint CEO. At that time, Sprint, a Kansas company, was near financial distress. In 2013, the company lost $5 billion, and in the previous 10 years, Sprint lost over $25 billion. And we had approximately $31 billion in debt. A great company with tens of thousands of jobs across the U.S. was at risk. Beginning in 2014, we undertook a massive and painful transformation of the company. We worked hard the same way we did at Brightstar, from the ground up. We reduced our expenses close to $6 billion through cost reductions, employee layoffs, and some unwanted transfers to jobs overseas. We didn't want to, but we had to. Today, Sprint is no longer in financial dire straits, but we face some significant challenges. Despite our success, we were unable to fix our main challenge, the quality of our network. We could not fix our network because of our poor financial condition and our lack of low-band spectrum. Because of our network quality, Sprint still struggles to attract lots of new customers, and many customers that we acquire leave at a faster pace than our competitors. Customers today are not willing to sacrifice quality. Today, the U.S. wireless market has become a duopoly. Verizon and AT&T have close to 70% market share, and they control 93% of the cash flow generated from the industry. As a result, it's very hard to invest and compete at the same level. Today, we're at a technological inflection point. Over the next few years, 5G is coming, a new standard of connectivity. It's going to completely change the way we connect and the way we live our lives. But Sprint doesn't have the resources to build a 5G network to provide the necessary competition against the AT&T and Verizon duopoly. We estimate that we will need close to $20 to $25 billion just to offer 5G in our limited coverage area. And because we don't generate any cash flow, we would have to raise more debt, and to pay for that debt, we would have to increase our prices to the American consumer. The only company that can build the world's best 5G network is a combination of Sprint and T-Mobile. And we can only do this if this merger is approved. As a combined company, we're committed to invest nearly $40 billion over the next 3 years to build the world's best 5G network with nationwide coverage. How can we do this together? It's simple. It is the marriage of two necessary and complementary 5G pieces. Sprint has high-capacity spectrum, which we've acquired over many years. T-Mobile has broad national coverage spectrum. It is capacity plus coverage. Today, we can build the world's most advanced, covering every corner in America in urban, suburban, and rural areas. We cannot take lightly that America needs to lead the world in 5G. China had made it their priority to win the 5G race. They're investing billions. When a country has the best network with the latest technology, it brings massive economic stimulus, explosive job growth, and a new wave of entrepreneurs. America is a land of innovators and disruptors. Let's keep it this way. My story validates this. Letting another country take the leadership away from the US will cause irreparable damage. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. In addition, yes, we are committed to lower prices. When we merge our two companies, we will create 8 times the network capacity that we would have on our own. We'll have to beat AT&T and Verizon on price to fill this capacity. This makes financial sense, it is good business, and most importantly, it is our commitment. Lastly, it is true that most mergers do not create jobs. This merger is the opposite. This is a growth story. This new company will create new jobs, blue-collar, white-collar jobs, jobs in urban, suburban, and rural America. We'll need skilled network engineers, construction crews, enterprise sales teams, call center jobs that we're going to bring back from overseas, and new sales reps for the new stores that we'll be opening. I can't thank you enough for allowing me to speak today. As I mentioned, I'm grateful to this country, and as an American entrepreneur, I hope you will approve this merger. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Ledger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and other members of the subcommittee for inviting Marcelo and me and the rest of the panel here today. Before I begin my remarks, let me offer condolences to Congresswoman Dingell on the loss of her husband, John Dingell, a towering figure in the House and a leader in this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to tell you about the tremendous benefits of the proposed T-Mobile-Sprint merger and the progress we're making towards making it a reality. So first, what will this merger deliver? It will deliver a supercharged Un-carrier, which can ensure U.S. leadership in 5G, increase competition, and create American jobs. First and foremost, the new T-Mobile will make sure America wins the global 5G race. This is so important because 5G will unlock new capabilities that will fuel innovation and job creation well beyond anything we've seen so far. 5G will completely transform the way Americans live, work, travel, and play. 5G means real-time navigation, downloading a movie in seconds, instant language translation, and much more. Nearly every business in America will be able to use 5G to revolutionize how they create and deliver goods and services. Best of all, with this transaction, the benefits of 5G won't just flow to big cities. Combining Sprint and T-Mobile will produce a faster, broader, deeper network that is truly nationwide. It will benefit consumers and businesses everywhere, including rural America. Neither company could achieve this on its own. Second, new T-Mobile will have the capital, the scale, and the network to supercharge competition, unleashing significant benefits for consumers that includes keeping prices low. The combined company will continue the T-Mobile tradition of disrupting the wireless space, and we will disrupt in-home broadband with new wireless broadband options, freeing millions from the stranglehold of big cable. Budget-conscious customers have the most to gain because they consume the most data. They have the most to gain when data costs less. It will be a huge leap across the digital divide. Our opponents are wrong when they claim that the merger will lead to higher prices. In fact, the opposite is true. Consumers will win with lower prices and better services. How? Our costs will drop sharply and our network capacity will expand tremendously. I am so confident that the merger will lower prices that we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. Last week, we committed in writing to regulators that we will make available the same or better rate plans as those offered by T-Mobile or Sprint for the next 3 years. Third, this merger will be a tremendous jobs creator at New T-Mobile and across our country. Our merger will be jobs positive from day one and going forward. The build-out of our 5G network, investment in new customer care centers, and expansion into new businesses like video distribution, broadband, and enterprise services means thousands more jobs than the two standalone companies would have needed. In the first year, we will have thousands more employees than the standalone companies combined. By 2024, we have 11,000 more employees. Our critics are wrong about the impact on jobs. I've looked at their arguments and supposed analysis, and they do not make sense. They ignore the facts. They don't account for any areas where jobs will grow, like network integration or new customer care centers. And by the way, we've heard this story before. They said we would cut 10,000 jobs when T-Mobile merged with Metro PCS. In fact, we expanded jobs by thousands. Let me say this to every T-Mobile and Sprint employee working in one of our stores today. Each of you will be offered a job with the new T-Mobile. Our opponents have also lobbed false allegations that this transaction will allow Huawei and ZTE into U.S. networks. Let me be clear. There is no Huawei or ZTE equipment in our network today, and there never will be. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Many have already recognized the tremendous benefits of this merger. CFIUS and Team Telecom have completed the national security review and approved the transaction. 16 of 19 states have completed their reviews and found the transaction to be in the public interest, and nearly 200 organizations, companies, government officials, and community leaders publicly support the transaction. I'm particularly honored that Congresswoman Eshoo, Congressman Shader, Congressman Long, and 10 other members have signed a bipartisan letter of support. To those that doubt us, I would simply say this. We are the Un-carrier. My management team and I believe on delivering on our promises, and we know if we do not, we will lose the credibility and the trust of our customers and employees. I can promise to you the new T-Mobile team will deliver for consumers, American workers, and for our country. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ledger. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shelton for 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and members of the
Microphone on? And point it towards your face there a little bit so we can.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and members of the committee. First, let me offer CWA's condolences on the passing of Chairman Dingell to all of you and to his family. My name is Chris Shelton. I'm the president of the Communications Workers of America. We represent 700,000 employees in telecommunications and other industries, including more than 45,000 in wireless. Let's tell it like it is. This merger would kill American jobs and raise prices on American consumers to enrich two foreign companies, Deutsche Telekom from Germany and SoftBank from Japan. Our analysis shows that 30,000 Americans would lose their jobs. More than 25,000 of those jobs would be in retail stores all across the country. Some owned directly by Sprint and T-Mobile, others owned by independent retailers. The other job cuts would be in headquarters. Sprint and T-Mobile compete with each other for the same type of customers, often low-income households, which is why their stores are located near each other's, sometimes right across the street. You'll see in Newark, New Jersey, how close the stores are together. You can see from the maps how Sprint and T-Mobile stores tend to be right next to each other. This is especially true for the prepaid brands, Boost and Metro PCS, which tend to be concentrated in lower-income areas. So if the companies merge, why would they keep two neighboring stores open? Chances are they won't. Rather than the merger will mean pink slips for 30,000 wireless workers across the country. You heard the CEO of T-Mobile say that they will add jobs. Pardon my language, but that's just bull. Without binding and enforceable commitments, and I mean commitments that have no loopholes, such promises are just cheap sales and talk and are easily broken. First, T-Mobile doesn't differentiate between internal employees and contractors, short-term temporary hires or long-term employees. Upgrading towers, for example, usually is done by temporary contractors, not full-time employees. Second, Mr. Ledger talks about call centers, but both companies have a long history of offshoring call center jobs, moving them to the Philippines, Mexico, and other non-U.S. locations. Third, T-Mobile has a track record of buying companies and then cutting jobs. After it acquired Iowa Wireless in 2018, it closed all iWireless call centers and more than 90% of its retail locations. It closed every single store in rural Iowa. Finally, trusting Sprint and T-Mobile with American jobs is like trusting a vampire at a blood bank. These are two of the worst companies in the United States when it comes to labor law and the treatment of workers. In recent years, T-Mobile has been charged with more labor law violations per worker than even Walmart. Violations include surveillance of employees and prohibiting workers from talking to each other about internal workplace investigations, even regarding sexual harassment complaints. And what about the people lucky enough to stay employed? The merger would drive down wages for all wireless retail market workers, in some cases by as much as $3,000 per year. Fewer firms competing for skilled labor means that each firm will pay its workers less. Employers compete for that skilled labor with wages and benefits. Take away competition, and the remaining companies can throttle down employees' compensation while jacking up prices on consumers. Both are symptoms of the same disease, too much market concentration. If Sprint and T-Mobile had not fought their workers who wanted a union, perhaps the employment and wage impact would not be as bad, but they did, and it is. To sum up, 30,000 fewer jobs, lower wages by as much as $3,000 per year, disproportionate harm to low-income communities, higher prices for all consumers, all to help a state-owned German company and a Japanese billionaire make more money. Members of the committee, that is not in the public interest. It's economic treason. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shelton. Ms. Bennett, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Please make sure your microphone's on and pull the microphone towards you. Yeah, thank you.
Chairman Pallone and Doyle, ranking members Walden and Latta, and members of the subcommittee. My feet don't touch the ground either, just so you know. My name is Carrie Bennett, and I'm with the Rural Wireless Association, and I first want to express my condolence to all of you all for your loss with Chairman Dingell. May his memory be a blessing. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today to discuss the impact that the proposed T-Mobile Sprint merger will have on rural America. RWA opposes this merger. We've heard a lot of promises from T-Mobile over the years that have not been met. So we have no reason to believe that T-Mobile will follow through on their new promises if they are allowed to reduce competition. In short, this merger is bad for competition. It's bad for consumers, especially in rural areas, who will experience fewer choices, price increases, and substandard service. It should be denied. T-Mobile has a poor track record in rural America. Let's face it, T-Mobile is making a lot of promises about how they will expand coverage in rural America and improve service for these Americans. But they have a long track record of doing just the opposite. And we have no reason to believe that this will change if the merger is approved. In fact, we think it will get a lot worse. I'm going to run through 3 examples of T-Mobile's behavior that have my members concerned. Roaming. Roaming arrangements are important to rural Americans. Roaming keeps urban, suburban, and rural Americans connected. Sprint has historically worked with rural carriers to ensure rural Americans have robust mobile wireless service. T-Mobile is not. In fact, according to our members, T-Mobile's roaming rates are 20 times higher than Sprint's. And T-Mobile's existing roaming agreements are one-sided. T-Mobile will frequently enter into unilateral roaming arrangements under which a rural carrier subscribers can roam on T-Mobile's network with no possibility of T-Mobile subscribers roaming on the rural carrier's network. In such cases, T-Mobile has simply determined that it is better for its own customers to do without coverage in rural areas, rather than pay the rural carrier for network access. This means that in those areas, T-Mobile's customers cannot be reached and are basically off the grid, all because T-Mobile chooses to restrict access. Do we really want a new T-Mobile's 100 million plus subscribers, which would be more than 1/3 of the market share, to be unable to access rural carriers' networks across the country? Next, rural call completion. Less than a year ago, the FCC found that T-Mobile failed to correct ongoing problems with delivery of calls to rural consumers. In fact, T-Mobile admittedly inserted false ringtones into these calls so that the caller believed the call was ringing on the other end, when it wasn't. Aside from blatantly breaking the law, T-Mobile's actions severely hindered rural consumers from running their businesses, communicating critical information to family and friends, and reaching emergency service personnel. This callous behavior, in an effort to save money, underscores the fact that T-Mobile's treatment of rural Americans is not in the public interest and harms rural telephone companies who would have received payments for terminating those calls. We believe that T-Mobile's destructive behavior will continue, perhaps even more aggressively once its rival Sprint is eliminated. Last, false broadband mapping claims. Our members have serious concerns about T-Mobile's broadband maps submitted in the FCC's Mobility Fund proceeding. That fund was created to provide $4.5 billion to mobile carriers over the next 10 years to help connect rural Americans who lack quality wireless broadband service. To make sure they know where the money is needed the most, the FCC asked wireless carriers to submit maps indicating where each carrier offers qualifying 4G broadband coverage. According to testing done by our members, when T-Mobile submitted its data, the company vastly overstated its rural coverage to make its reach even seem bigger than it was. When rural carriers went to test T-Mobile's claims, 95.8% of the tests showed speeds below the threshold demanded by the FCC, or no 4G broadband service at all. In many of the places where T-Mobile certified it had coverage, cell sites had not been even put into operation. If left unrectified, carriers will be denied funds, causing a loss of service to rural consumers who rely on this funding to connect. The FCC is currently reviewing this issue, but before the FCC can make a public interest determination regarding this proposed merger, it must first find that T-Mobile has been honest in its dealings with the FCC. Our members' drive tests strongly suggest otherwise. The FCC should not approve a merger if an unresolved enforcement proceeding is pending. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brake, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to share the views of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF, on the pending merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. First, let me briefly echo the condolences to the Dingle family. He was a real legend and will be missed by all of us and all the members, as well as his Twitter followers everywhere. With that, ITIF strongly believes that a combination of Sprint and T-Mobile would bring about a better future for American businesses and consumers compared to one which each company attempted to continue alone. In my written testimony, I explore several reasons to support this merger. In these opening remarks, I would like to focus on 3 key issues. First, this merger provides an accelerated transition to robust 5G. Second, more competitors is not always better, or put another way, there's nothing special about the number 4. And lastly, I'd like to discuss the right way to define the market when thinking about this transition. First, and perhaps most importantly, 5G. The key point here is that a combined firm would have both the spectrum assets and financial strength to deploy a robust 5G network with broader coverage and significantly more capacity compared to what either company could provide alone. Not all 5G is the same. Around the world, carriers are in the process of exploring business models, deploying pilots, and incrementally replacing old equipment with new 5G gear. These initial exploratory offerings are different in kind, however, from the 5G network the parties envision. The combination of T-Mobile's low-band, wide coverage 600 megahertz spectrum and Sprint's high-capacity 2.5 gigahertz spectrum would make for a high-performance, nationwide, next-generation network that would help propel U.S. leadership and economic competitiveness, not just in 5G itself, but in the applications that an advanced network enables. This is incredibly important because 5G is anticipated to being more than just faster, more responsive phones. The technology is designed to be adaptive to a wide variety of use cases, hopefully driving significant productivity gains throughout the economy. The capacity from a new 5G network would effectively increase the supply of wireless services, again, more than the two companies could provide separately. We should expect this increased supply to maintain downward pressure on prices, including in the wholesale and prepaid market segments. Second, let's talk about competition. You'll hear some of my friends, or you already heard some of my friends on the panel, argue that the government must preserve 4 carriers for competition. But competition is a means, not an end unto itself. Of course, any market can have too few competitors, but it can also have too many, resulting in wasteful duplication of resources. I want to stress that again. More competitors is not always better. This is especially true given the economics of communications networks, which feature tremendously high fixed upfront costs to serve a given geographic area. These high fixed infrastructure costs allow for vigorous competition with relatively few competitors compared to other industries. We should want infrastructure companies to compete at sufficient scale. A combined company could do more with less, allowing the new firm to drive greater value throughout the business, ultimately passing a significant share on to consumers in the form of lower prices, a higher quality network, or innovative new offerings. A market of 3 healthy, relatively equal-sized companies that continue to invest and innovate is far, far better than a lopsided market with 2 firms considerably stronger than the others. There is no reason to preserve 4 for 4's sake. Lastly, it is important to not define the market too narrowly and acknowledge the dynamic forces changing competition. 5G is accelerating what are already rapidly differentiating business models in wireless services. Basic connectivity is increasingly commodified, and wireless companies are instead looking to new revenue sources to recoup their large ongoing investments. These new revenue opportunities include Internet of Things services, connected vehicles and drones, over-the-top video services, advertising, and perhaps most notably, fixed wireless broadband to the home, which is in turn prompting cable providers to explore wireless entry. These new business models, with value-added services built on top of basic connectivity, are likely to keep downward pressure on price for the traditional bundles of voice, text, and data, whether there are 3 or more facilities operators. Because this merger will accelerate flourishing U.S. 5G future, improves the market structure with 3 strong firms with sufficient scale to vigorously compete, and comes at a time of rapidly changing business models, we believe it is in the public interest and hope it is quickly approved. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Barrenbrook, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lata, and members of the subcommittee. And I want to associate myself and public knowledge with the statements of the panel and the members of the subcommittee honoring Chairman Dingell's life and his service. Thank you for inviting me to appear today, and thank you for shining a light on the harms of the proposed Sprint T-Mobile merger. Today's hearing will show that this proposed merger is a bad deal for consumers, for competition, and for America's wireless future. The evidence clearly shows that this transaction does not serve the public interest and is unlawful under the antitrust laws. As you consider this deal, ask yourself, what will it mean for each of your constituents who rely daily on their smartphones? The answer is clear. They will ultimately pay higher prices and have fewer choices for wireless service. Since announcing their intention to merge in April 2018, the companies have failed to show that the merger would not violate competition laws. They have failed to show that the merger would affirmatively serve the public interest as required for FCC approval, and they have failed to show that other public interest benefits would be offset by the merger's substantial reduction in competition. The evidence Sprint and T-Mobile have presented to the FCC and the Department of Justice shows that consolidating the wireless market down to 3 national players would result in substantially higher prices for consumers. And you don't have to take my word for it. The economic analysis submitted by the companies admits as much. Recent promises that the merged company will not raise prices in the near term underscore the obvious. Post-merger, the marketplace will not be competitive enough to discipline the 3 remaining national carriers when they raise prices. The proposed transaction will eliminate competition and choices for consumers. It will inflict significant harm on low-income prepaid and rural consumers who can least afford to pay more. Additionally, the deal will lead to tens of thousands of lost jobs and lower wages for the workers that remain. The merger will eliminate avenues for new competitors to enter the wireless market. And finally, the deal will harm small and rural wireless providers and their subscribers who rely on competitive choices for roaming and wholesale. Remember, under the FCC's public interest analysis, the company's burden is not merely to show that there is a lack of public interest harms. They must demonstrate specific public interest benefits that would directly flow from the transaction. The FCC is charged with affirmatively promoting competition, not merely maintaining or protecting the existing level of competition. The companies have not shown that this merger would increase competition or benefit the public interest. The Commission's public interest standard is rooted in the text of the Communications Act, and the Commission is charged with ensuring the availability of advanced telecommunications to all Americans and that quality services are provided at just, reasonable, affordable rates. The merger would frustrate all of these fundamental goals. For nearly a year, Sprint and T-Mobile have attempted to overcome these overwhelming yet predictable harms to the public interest, consumers, and competition. To distract from the damage this merger would inflict on wireless competition, the companies insist that this merger is about competing with cable companies. Don't buy it. We've heard this before. This is exactly the same song AT&T and T-Mobile sang when they tried to merge in 2011. Policymakers, the public, and enforcement agencies rejected these arguments then, and these claims are similarly hollow and misleading today. The merger benefits alleged by the companies have collapsed under public scrutiny, and the company's economic and engineering models have come under substantial attack, and they actually undermine the case the companies are making here today. The DOJ, the FCC, and this subcommittee must follow the objective evidence they collect, rather than relying on unverifiable and unenforceable commitments made by the companies. That evidence includes prior public statements by the companies themselves, prior FCC and DOJ evaluations of 4 to 3 wireless market mergers, international wireless market comparisons. All of this evidence clearly shows that the merger will gut competition in the wireless market, lead to dramatically higher prices for every wireless consumer. Further, the evidence undermines the speculative and unverifiable benefits the companies continue to allege and have done so here today. To be clear, this merger is not necessary to build 5G networks. It will not increase investments in 5G. On their own, the companies are already competing to deploy robust 5G networks. This will continue, preserving the well-documented benefits of vigorous four-firm competition. And it will not lead to new deployments in rural areas or help close the digital divide. Thank you for your invitation to appear here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. With the conclusion of witness testimony, we're now going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. And let me say to my colleagues that I love you all dearly, and it pains me greatly to bring the gavel down when you've exceeded your 5 minutes. But the kindness that I showed last week resulted in many people going much, much over their 5-minute time. So if you're near the very end and you ask the question and it takes more than 5 minutes for the answer, we'll certainly let that happen. But after 5 minutes, please, no more questions, or I'm going to have to enforce it with the gavel. So, and I'll try to set an example by yielding myself 5 minutes and staying within the time. So, Mr. Ledger, I'm going to ask you and Mr. Barronbrook the same question but a different way. And I'm going to hold you each to 45 seconds because I've only got 5 minutes. So tell me, Mr. Ledger, why you think this merger is different than other mergers in the past in highly concentrated areas. Tell me why you think this isn't going to result in some of the things we've seen in other mergers where it did raise prices and it didn't bring competition. What's different about this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In general, the issue with mergers is that industries consolidate, supply goes down, prices go up, and jobs are eliminated. This is a unique merger where the outcome of this merger will be a significant increase in supply in the form of 8 times the capacity that our network will make available. It will bring an 87% decline in the price per gig of data, and jobs will go up. So this is dramatically different. It's unique at the advent of 5G. The complementary nature of these networks increases supply significantly, which will decrease prices. That's quite different.
Thank you, and that was within the 45 seconds. I appreciate it. So, Mr. Barron, tell me in the same amount of time why you think this merger is going to be the same as any other merger.
Thank you for the question. So this merger is remarkably similar to AT&T T-Mobile. That merger was rejected by DOJ and the FCC in 2011. That deal would have led to DOJ and the FCC found higher prices, less competition to discipline the marketplace. Less competition would also mean less innovation in service plans, less robust networks, lower customer service quality, less incentives to invest and deploy. Those things are all true here. But in some instances, this merger is actually worse. We're actually eliminating both of the smaller maverick competitors that challenge and discipline the behavior of the 2 larger companies in the marketplace. They're also increasing harms to the prepaid market, low-income consumers, the Lifeline marketplace, and then lastly, the roaming and MVNO marketplace. Those harms are exacerbated here compared to AT&T T-Mobile.
Thank you. Mr. Sheldon, if a Sprint employee is working at a retail store and they lose their job because they are working across the street from a T-Mobile store, is the claim being made that that employee will get another retail job in that area, or do you think rather it's potentially that these jobs will be displaced and at best replaced by different types of jobs in different communities? Would you put your mic on?
First of all, it may not be a Sprint employee that loses their job, and that's kind of the problem with the numbers here. Most of the
Pull your mic towards you.
Most of the stores are independent contractors who don't have Sprint employees. But I don't see how even a Sprint employee, say in Pittsburgh, would lose their job in Pittsburgh because of a consolidation of stores and end up in Pittsburgh. They might end up in Nebraska if Mr. Ledger keeps his word and offers that employee a job, but I don't see how they're going to, because of the concentration of stores. After this company merges, if it merged, they'd have twice the number of stores that either AT&T or Verizon has now. So stores are going to be closed no matter what happens.
Thank you. Mr. Barron-Brook, what precedent is set by allowing competitors to merge to achieve an evolutionary step in technology? I mean, what happens then for 6G or 7G, and how did the government view similar claims for 3G and 4G?
Yeah, Congressman, that's a good question. So, as you'll recall, in AT&T T-Mobile, one of the claims the companies made was that they couldn't deploy 4G LTE coverage to the entirety of their network footprints, to the rest of the country, if they didn't merge. The government evaluated the evidence that was before it. They rejected that. They found that that was not credible. They found that competition was likely to lead to deployment, not consolidation. The same is true here. And so essentially, if you buy into the argument that we need to allow these companies to merge for 5G, by the way, that is directly contrary to the statements they've made to Wall Street and investors, even very recently. It essentially sets the precedent that whenever there's a need for these companies to invest in new infrastructure to deploy 6G, 7G, as you said, the gates are open to additional consolidation. Consumers need more competition for lower prices and better services, not fewer.
And I see I have 7 seconds left, and I'm going to yield it back to set a good example for the rest of my colleagues. And I will now yield to the ranking member.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for yielding. And Mr. Brake, if I could start with my question with you. My district is a microcosm of the country, going from Toledo to suburban neighborhoods, all the way to small communities and sparsely rural counties. The state of New York is also well known for being split between rural and urban communities. What lessons can the committee draw from the New York Public Safety Commission's approval of this merger last week in terms of benefits on both for the rural and urban communities?
Sure, yes. Thank you for the question, Mr. Latta. Yes, the New York Public Service Commission, I think the main takeaway is that this Public Service Commission took a hard look at this merger, determined that it was in the public interest, and allowed it to go forward with minimal conditions, modest conditions related to jobs. It saw that it was benefiting the state long term. As far as your question regarding both urban and rural areas, I think the most important point, again, is this combination of complementary spectrum assets. You have the low band 600 megahertz spectrum that provides great coverage to a wider area, but is relatively limited in the capacity that it can offer, compared to the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum assets that Sprint has ready to deploy for 5G, which has a much greater capacity. So with the two of those combined, you get a much better network in terms of both coverage that can help provide, maybe not the greatest capacity, but a wider area in rural areas to provide much of the service of 5G. But also in urban areas, you get a much greater capacity with a 2.5 gigahertz to see a more robust 5G network, again, than either company could provide on its own, or even greater than the two individual companies combined, if you want to put it that way. I would note, however, the jurisdiction of states is somewhat different than the review at the DOJ and the FCC. So if I may, if there's time, one of the main issues that is unique to the state level jurisdiction is that of jobs. And so with any merger, there are going to be jobs created and jobs destroyed, right? I mean, that's inevitable. The companies say that there'll be a job creator from day one, and apparently the New York Public Service Commission was content with that assertion, in addition to some commitments, and I believe a call center being built in New York. And this is a somewhat unpopular point, particularly with politicians, but wireless services, this is not a jobs program, right? Again, perhaps an unpopular point, but if the companies combined, not even specifically this merger, but any companies can provide a greater output, more capacity, greater services with fewer inputs, including labor, that is the definition of productivity. That is what drives economic growth in this country and should be a good thing. I recognize that's not a popular opinion, especially among politicians, but productivity growth is an important component for this.
Thank you.
This merger and
Ms. Bennett, would you like to comment on New York? Right. Would you like to comment?
Well, I was just going to point out. I was just going to point out that the review by the New York Public Service Commission is not looking at. It's looking at the jobs issue. It's not looking at the overall merger. That's regulated to the DOJ and to the FCC, and they do not have jurisdiction over that. I wanted to hop back to a point, though, that Mr. Leger made about 87% decline in prices per gig. I'd like to see some of that pass through on the roaming rates, because right now roaming rates are about 10 times to 15 times higher than the retail rates they offer their own customers. So it's interesting to me that in a wholesale environment, the carriers are charging more than the retail environment. So the cost is definitely lower if they can pass on retail rates that are lower than the wholesale rates. Sorry, not your question, but I just wanted to go back to that for a minute.
Yeah, thank you.
Congressman, can I jump in for 1 second? I apologize.
I'm sorry, I'm almost out of time here. Mr. Ledger, if I could, I've got about 38 seconds left. If you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I would like to comment, and I appreciate the comparison. Yes, the New York Public Commission is one of 16 states that has approved the merger, and their review looked at all of the same issues, what it's going to mean for the state from a standpoint of 5G, median speeds of 450 megabits, the promise of 5G, while having prices decline, having jobs go up. This was reviewed in total, and all of the benefits that we preach about this merger, New York saw, and we committed with them to the things that are appropriate for them, and the promise of it is similar to the reviews that are taking place with the FCC and the DOJ.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, the full committee chairman, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. It's no secret that unions are under attack. Corporations have sought to limit the power of unions, which are fighting to make sure workers are fairly treated and get a livable wage. And what we're seeing is a growing disparity between the people at the top and the hardworking people like those in New Jersey, the folks who haven't seen a dime of the huge corporate profits and the Trump tax giveaways. And just this week, news reports highlighted that the average tax refund will be 8.4% less this year, so much for the GOP tax reform. Now, the CWA has argued that the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint could wipe out as many as 30,000 jobs, about 25,000 in retail, and about 5,000 corporate. At the same time, T-Mobile has announced it will be opening 5 new customer experience centers if the merger is approved, which will create up to 5,600 jobs by 2021. So I wanted to ask Mr. Ledger about that. In 2012, T-Mobile shut down 7 call centers and allegedly sent the jobs overseas. But now, you're saying that we're going to have these new customer centers. Is there anything in the law or any legally enforceable protections to ensure that these new center jobs are actually created? And if those jobs are created, is there anything in the law or any legally enforceable protections to ensure that they wouldn't be outsourced in a few years to somewhere else?
Thank you, Congressman. The couple of things I'd like to insert is, and I'm very proud of my tenure of being the CEO since the end of 2012. I would point out that the employees, badge-carrying T-Mobile employees since that time have gone up 250%. The employees of Metro...
Mr. Ledger, is your microphone on?
Yes?
Okay.
Okay.
Pull that a little
Sorry
closer
about
so
that.
we can hear you.
But I have had a 250% increase in employees, badge-carrying employees at T-Mobile since the time I've been CEO. I also would like to point out that I'm very proud of the over 50 workplace awards that the company has worked to attain, including the 100 best companies to work for.
Mr. Ledger, could you address the call centers? If not, I'm just going to move on because I don't have that much time.
Yeah, the call centers, the 5,600 jobs, including 2,000 additional, making it 7,500 to 7,600 jobs, are a critical integrated part of our business plan, our filing with the DOJ, our support documentation to the FCC, and it's something that I'm completely committed to.
All right, Mr. Shelton, if I could ask you, does that comfort you, his response, or what's your take on how this merger would affect wages?
Our belief is that it will have a downward effect on wages, and we have a study from the Economic Policy Institute and the Roosevelt Institute that just like prices go up with less competition, wages go down with less competition for labor. The one exception is where you have collective bargaining, but T-Mobile and Sprint oppose collective bargaining. And if I may, when T-Mobile laid off those 3,300 people, call center people in the past, they said that the work did not go overseas. The Labor Department did an investigation and found out that it went to the Philippines. So, how do we take their word now? And if you look, not only has the workforce in the United States increased, but also the workforce in the Philippines and lots of other countries has increased by leaps and bounds.
All right, let me ask Mr. Ledger, if I can, one more question about resiliency of the nation's communication systems and public safety. My district was hurt probably more than any other district by Superstorm Sandy, and we've done a lot since then on a bipartisan basis to try to address resiliency for the communication systems. And I see that the FCC's 2017 Atlantic hurricane season impact on communications report outlines a portion of the problem. Notes that in 2017, the U.S. experienced 16 natural disasters with costs totaling $360 billion. I'd like, Mr. Chairman, to enter that into the record, if I could, that report.
Without objection, so ordered.
But my worry is that consolidation and network infrastructure could prioritize cost savings over resiliency in the face of disasters. And I noticed network resiliency wasn't addressed in your public interest statement at the FCC. So, Mr. Ledger, there's much time. Can you explain why you chose to leave this issue out of that public interest statement, and whether you had discussions with the FCC regarding how this deal will affect network resiliency and public safety?
Yeah, thank you for that important question, sir. I think the FCC's feedback on the increase in resiliency and the response to natural disasters in the last year or two by T-Mobile has been industry-leading and something that they're extremely proud of. Resiliency of our networks has been a critical priority, and it is a critical priority of the new T-Mobile's network. And you know, this infrastructure plan will significantly increase the resiliency of our network, and it is part of the plan.
All right, thank you so much.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I start, I want to thank you for your concern about these jobs. Now, you know, we had a hostile takeover here at this committee, and we lost about half our staff. And I'm just wondering, in this new spirit of protection of lost jobs, can we get those back?
Yeah, were they reassigned to a different neighborhood?
Yeah, you could say that. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Mr. Berenbach, I know Mr. Brake talked in his testimony about the number 4 carriers. Is there a magic to number 4 in terms of competition in this space? Is there some magic to 4 versus 5 versus 3 versus 8?
You know, it's a good question. The key, as the Department of Justice and the FCC looked at this deal, isn't whether there's a magic number of firms in the marketplace. It's, do the players in the marketplace, does the structure of the marketplace promote lower prices, more investment, better choices for consumers, more deployment of broadband services? And we believe, frankly, that when you take these two companies and you merge them together, you eliminate the mavericks, the companies that have been the driving competitive forces in the industry. So to answer your question directly, I don't believe there's a per se magic number. It's about market structure, but this transaction has significant concerns.
Mr. Brake, do you want to comment on that briefly?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, right, there's no real magic to the number 4, but it seems to be a lot of the folks pushing to preserve 4 seem to think that more is necessarily better. You know, why not 5? Why not 6? Why not 7? And the answer is clear. It's because then you end up with all of this duplication of infrastructure that leads to a fragmentation of market, increases costs that ultimately have to be borne by consumers of the network, right? And so the question is, what's the optimal balance between, you know, competition that drives down prices, continues innovation, but doesn't see these duplication of resources? Considering the limited cash flow and the high debt of Sprint, there's a good indication that optimal number is closer to 3 rather than 4.
All right. Thank you both. I appreciate your perspectives on that. I want to turn to our other representatives here. Talk to me, Mr. Clary and Mr. Ledger, about roaming rates and what we should anticipate, consumers, and about data, both data access and costs. Going to go up, going to go down. As you both know, my district's pretty enormous and gives new definition to rural and remote. And we're concerned about how these two would work. And I don't know which between you wants to go first on that, but please, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Congressman. One of the most important pillars of this merger is the increase in capacity. Basically, when you put these two networks together, you're going to create 8 times the capacity. So to put things in perspective, imagine if you had a stadium in which 2/3 of it is empty. Pretty much you're going to have an economic incentive to basically reduce prices and find different people to fill this capacity. This is why we've been very clear, and we made a commitment to lower prices. Traditionally, in most mergers, you don't find companies that go and make a voluntary filing to the FCC like John and T-Mobile did, basically making a commitment that prices will remain the same or lower. It's a question of capacity. We're going to have more capacity than ever before, 8 times capacity, so we got to fill it, and that's going to be filled by the different partners in the industry.
All right. Mr. Ledger, you want to address those 2 issues as well?
Yes, thank you, sir. I would first say, let's be clear. The wireless industry is a duopoly controlled by AT&T and Verizon, who control over 80% of the profitability and 95% of the cash flow. And after the merger, they will still have almost 70% market share. What we've done for 6 years at T-Mobile as the Un-carrier, the whole thesis of this transaction is to use this increase in supply, capacity, and decreased price to supercharge the Un-carrier, to bring competition. You will see users have a 87% decline in the price per gigabit of data. You will have an 8-fold increase. Users will go from 10 gigs to 80 gigs, and that's just in wireless. We expect to take that competition also to the cable industry, which is not only a duopoly, it's a monopoly. And most of America, 79%, have no more than one choice for high-speed broadband access, and we plan on entering that market, having as many as 9.6 million customers serving 50% of the geography of the United States, and saving just in that part over $13 billion a year to people on their cable and in-home broadband bills.
All right. I thank all of our witnesses for your comments. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, but I first want to reiterate my colleagues and the panelists on recognizing the leadership that John Dingell provided on a bipartisan way to get legislation done that was sustainable in the long run, and hope we can continue in that tradition. Many households in my district live paycheck to paycheck. More than a quarter have an annual income of less than $35,000 a year. If these households are faced with even a couple more dollars each month, it could mean they no longer have access to wireless service. So, Mr. Ledger, can you cite any recent example where a country went from 4 to 3 wireless carriers and prices did not increase?
Thank you very much for the question, sir. And the types of customers that you describe, we are disproportionately serving, both at T-Mobile and at Sprint, and they disproportionately have benefited from what we've done because they're the
Which
highest.
is why we're worried about the merger reducing competition to that sector of the population.
Thank you, sir. Since we've acquired Metro PCS, the average price of a prepaid service to our customers have gone down 4%, but the data usage has gone up 12-fold.
But you really didn't answer my question. Any recent examples of countries that went from 4 to 3 and did not have prices increase?
I'm not a study in the countries around the world,
I understand.
Sir.
Mr. Berenbach, is it true that the 3 to 4 merger of T-Mobile, Nederland, and Orange led to price increases in the Netherlands compared to other control countries?
Yes, Congressman, between 10 to 17% price increases.
Wow. And is it true that when Austria went from 4 to 3 wireless carriers, the prices also increased?
Yes, sir, between 14 and 20%. And what's particularly important in that market is that one of the 3 remaining players is one of T-Mobile's sister companies, T-Mobile Austria.
Wouldn't this merger have an even greater impact on lower-income people who depend on prepaid services, since we would be moving from 3 to 4 facility-based prepaid providers?
Yes, sir, I believe it would. You know, in this marketplace, in the prepaid market, you tend to have only 3 players currently, T-Mobile, Sprint, who would merge, and AT&T. T-Mobile and Sprint would have a dominant position in that marketplace and have the power and incentives to raise prices on those prepaid customers who, you know, frankly are likely to be lower income, likely to be mobile only, likely to be consumers of color, and frankly would have no other choices in the marketplace. So prices would go up on them and they'd have nowhere else to turn.
Thank you. Mr. Ledger, I have a letter here from you to the chairman of the FCC dated February 4th of this year, in which you stated, I want to reiterate unequivocally that new T-Mobile rates will not go up. Rather, our merger will ensure that American consumers will pay less and get more. And I'm going to submit this to the committee without objection. Is it also correct that on the same day you submitted a letter to counsel for T-Mobile, submitted an ex parte filing to the FCC that further articulated this commitment?
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to submit this to the committee without objection. Mr. Berenbach, I'm curious to take into your opinion on this commitment.
Well, thank you for the question, and this is an important issue. So the history of these merger conditions, behavioral merger conditions in concentrated markets, is not a positive one. We saw this with conditions on Comcast, where it violated its merger conditions with regards to Bloomberg.
Well, let me ask you
Comcast.
specifically. If a small amount of data is added to T-Mobile and Sprint legacy plans, consumers could see an increase in the amount they pay for their plans. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Under the letter that was filed last week, that appears to be the case.
Is it your opinion that under the proposed condition, legacy Sprint and T-Mobile fees could be hiked and there would be nothing to stop that?
Yes, sir. And even if those fees were hiked, and even if those were covered by the commitment that T-Mobile has said it has made, how are consumers supposed to enforce that? Are they supposed to, come to the FCC, which has forsworn rate regulation, and asked it to step in and enforce this on T-Mobile. It just seems impractical and unenforceable.
And yes or no, is it your opinion that under the proposed condition, Legacy, Sprint, and T-Mobile surcharges could be hiked, and there would be nothing to stop that? Yes or no, please?
Yes.
Sir, could I respond to some of
Yeah, I'm going to just wrap up here. I hope that your promise to the people will get more for what they are paying holds true. My concern is that many people won't even be in a position to take advantage of that promise because they might not be able to scramble the extra cash they need. Simply put, I'm worried about many of the constituents that I have would be priced out. And my time's expired, and I yield to Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ledger, you can respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. With respect, my colleague continues to interpret what is taking place at the FCC through his interpretation of what the outcome is before their work is complete, that I highly respect what's taking place. Several things. I want to be clear. I have worked very hard to rid the lines between postpaid and prepaid, such that...
Yeah, let me ask, because I was going to have that question anyway. I'm old enough to know the uncola. We're using the term the uncarrier. So describe uncarrier.
Yeah, uncarrier is a term that I coined. It was the thesis and the genesis of who we were going to be. And what it was we set out to fix a stupid, broken, wireless, arrogant industry by listening to customers and solving all the pain points and removing those barriers.
Like what? Give me some quick examples.
We eliminated contracts, eliminated international data roaming, free music streaming, et cetera.
So let me go follow up on this question. So if you enter as a more dominant competitor to AT&T and Verizon, wouldn't that uncarrier characteristics carry into that competitive marketplace? Are you going to jettison that?
Yes, sir. My goal has been not just to differentiate myself by the changes, but to force AT&T and Verizon to change so that the wireless industry would adapt. I've been successful in changing the industry, but I'm not breaking through because I don't have the scale and the resource and capability. The goal here is to supercharge that uncarrier and force AT&T and Verizon to invest more in 5G, to lower prices, broaden services, go deeper into in-home broadband, and I believe that is possible through this merger.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I was, Mr. Chari, kind of what's going to happen if the merger gets approved? You do bring something beneficial to this debate, especially for the rural folks. Greg Walden represents rural America. I represent rural America. Billy Long. We got a lot of folks here that's concerned. Is there a way to carry that roaming debate that Sprint trumpeted to this new merged company? Hit your mic.
Thank you for your question. Today, Sprint has contracts with most of the rural carriers, and those are contracts. And it's been very clear with John that the new T-Mobile will plan to honor the contracts that Sprint has signed. What is important for most of you who have people in the rural parts of the country, it's very simple. T-Mobile did not have 600 megahertz spectrum, so T-Mobile couldn't basically build a nationwide coverage. Today, they do. They lack the capacity that combined with our spectrum. So we are going to bring 5G to every corner of America, and that's going to be a huge differentiator. You've seen the lack of competition that exists today in rural America.
So, Mr. Ledger, I would hope that would be part of the new corporate culture as far as if this is a successful merged company, and I think my folks in the rural wireless would like to see that too.
Yes, sir, 100%. I would just like to point out that when you take the topic of rural, there's two important components. The rural customer, right now, who is not being served, does not have choice, and the rural carrier. Both of those players will be served greatly by this transaction. I clearly have honored that I will commit to honor all of the agreements that Sprint has, and I believe that we'll be in a position to negotiate even better things for the rural players. And I believe that in that partnership, we can be the rural players' partner to bring them to the 5G evolution, and the winner will be rural customers.
Thank you, Mr. Ledger. With my remaining time, I want to try to get two things done. One is to remind my colleagues that this evening at 6 in the Rayburn foyer, the Next Generation 911 has their award ceremony, especially if you're new on the committee, want to know 911, telecommunications, location. That's a good event to stop by, and I would encourage you to do that. And Mr. Baron Brock, I'm sorry. In your comments in your testimony, you lauded the Department of Justice on their decision on the T-Mobile, what was it, AT&T merger. Our point is you have the FCC and Department of Justice making this ruling. Do you trust the DOJ to make the ruling without, as Chairman Walden said, our ranking member Walden said, political influence?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, that's obviously that issue of political influence has come up with regards to merger reviews in the past. Yes, I do trust the staff of the Department of Justice to fully review the evidence before them, the staff at the FCC to fully review the evidence and to make those recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Lobsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do thank the chair and the ranking member for having this hearing today, and I want to thank all of you for being here as well. It's been pretty enlightening. I think it's an important hearing. I'm happy to hear that there has been a lot of focus on rural areas, both sides of the aisle. We represent, many of us on this committee represent significant rural areas. So I'm going to get right to my first question. Ms. Bennett, in your testimony, you state that T-Mobile has, and I quote, determined that it is better for its business to do without any coverage in rural areas, unquote. As a representative of a rural district, not as big as some of them, but nonetheless pretty darn big, 12,000, 13,000 square miles, 24 counties, where coverage can often be dismal or non-existent. I get around my district all the time. I experience this whenever I'm back. I find that particular assertion very worrying, as you might imagine. Can you clarify a little bit more on that point?
Certainly, and I appreciate the question. Our members who have built out the rural networks in their rural areas, and it's not everywhere, to be clear, it's only in the areas that they serve.
And you did mention Iowa in your testimony.
Yes, yes. And what has happened is in negotiations with T-Mobile elects not to, they lack restrict. It's a technology that you can put in place so that their customers don't have access to those rural carriers' networks. So they have roaming agreements because under the FCC's rules, they have to let the rural carriers' customers roam on their network, but not the reciprocal. So that they choose not to do that, and that's because they probably don't want to pay the roaming charges to the rural carriers.
Well, if T-Mobile and Sprint are combining services, can T-Mobile make a structural commitment to use Sprint's rural carrier service model?
Those are very hard to enforce after the fact, and to go back to the favorable agreements that we have with Sprint right now, those are expiring, and we haven't been able to get any certainty from Sprint about whether those would continue, regardless of whether the merger goes through. They've just been silent. They've gone silent on us and have told us that we have to wait until the merger is done.
Okay.
Or not done.
Thank you. My second question is for Mr. Shelton. CWA recently released a report on the impact in Iowa from T-Mobile's acquisition of iWireless, which has been mentioned. One of the things that stuck out to me from this report was a dramatic decrease of T-Mobile's retail footprint in Iowa. Can you expand a little further regarding T-Mobile's acquisition of iWireless and how that reduced access in rural parts of my state and district?
Yes, when they bought the company in Iowa, they closed down 90% of the stores, and now for a consumer in Iowa, in a rural place in Iowa, they have to drive 68 to 100 miles to get to the nearest T-Mobile store in Iowa. And if you look at the company's plans, their own plans say that 46 million rural customers will not be served by their 5G network. So that does not bode well for Iowa.
And actually, I know it's kind of difficult in this political environment to demonstrate fairness, but I'm going to do it in this case, Mr. Ledger. I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond and make your case because, to be frank, Ms. Bennett's and Mr. Shelton's remarks leave me very concerned about the potential negative outcomes in Iowa. I know there are at least two sides to every story, so I want to give you a chance to respond to them. And in particular, will T-Mobile make structural commitments to rural constituents of my state who may stand to lose jobs, coverage, or retail services?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And the facts associated with what's happening with Iowa Wireless, I'd be glad to submit after the hearing as well. But let's just be clear. There are 100 more employees than there were a year ago in Iowa. There are 35 Metro PCS, Metro by T-Mobile stores, equaling the number of what the stores were there before. And Iowa Wireless was a failing company stuck in 2G and 3G, and we came in and provided the investment. We spent $70 million so far upgrading to the 4G and now moving to 5G network.
I am kind of running out of time here. I want you to address the structural agreement issue going forward.
I'd be glad to look at ways to make that commitment, and I would point out that part of our plan is to cover 96% of the 62 million people in rural America with LTE coverage and 84% of all of rural America with greater than 25 megabits of in-home broadband.
And a group of politicians here, we make promises quite a lot. I would like this to be in writing. It's what I'd like it to be. I'd like to see you make that commitment, that structural commitment,
They'll be in
to
my
make sure that
business
we have
plan
that
as well.
access here in Iowa. Thank you very much, Mr. Ledger. And I've got 10 seconds left. I'm going to yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now recognize my good friend from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel being with us today. Mr. Ledger, historically, Sprint has been an effective partner with rural wireless providers, say that fast, allowing their customers to access Sprint's voice and data network when roaming. I represent a very, very rural district in Appalachia. Ms. Bennett has testified that T-Mobile has been unwilling to partner with rural providers or otherwise serve rural America. Can you share what services the new T-Mobile intends to provide in rural America, and if there are any plans to partner with rural providers? I know we've alluded to some of this already, but if you could do it for me, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. Two things I'd like to point out. One is, historically, T-Mobile has not had the wherewithal to provide full capabilities in rural America. We were a very densely urban company with no low-band spectrum that covered rural America, and we only recently have that. New T-Mobile will have significantly more ability to do that. Secondly, Sprint's not going away. This is a merger between T-Mobile and Sprint, and all of the good of Sprint will be part of the integrated T-Mobile, and we plan to carry those forward. And I believe that in addition to providing broader services to rural customers, better LTE coverage, in-home broadband, I believe that we have a great ability to be a partner with rural carriers. We need their help with last mile access, with capabilities, and I think we can provide them with a pathway to 5G. So I think it's the best partnership for both rural customers and rural carriers.
All right, well, thank you for that. So specifically then, will the new T-Mobile continue to make wholesale agreements available that are in line with those currently made by Sprint or T-Mobile?
Yes, sir, and all wholesale agreements are currently contractual. We will honor those. I believe with the supply and capacity that the new T-Mobile will have, that wholesale rates are only going to get better. In fact, carriers that have agreements with both Sprint and T-Mobile will be able to choose the better of those and the alternative that suits them as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. Brake, Ms. Bennett's testimony indicates that the new T-Mobile would have zero incentive, quote, zero incentive to provide commercially reasonable roaming rates, terms, and conditions to RWA members. Although aren't there rules at the FCC in place to ensure that carriers do just that? And if they do not, there are enforcement mechanisms that the FCC can take?
That's right. Thank you for the question. So the rural coverage is a multifaceted issue. This roaming issue is a narrow component of it. And I just want to be very clear about the sort of dynamic here, right? The members of the Rural Wireless Association enjoyed favorable negotiations with Sprint, mainly because they had a very small network focused on cities and did not have the rural coverage. And so, I don't mean to disparage the members, right? There's nothing more American than trying to, serve your community with wireless services, but this is a wildly inefficient system to have a bunch of small rural operators trying to negotiate with a small, limited coverage nationwide carrier is not an efficient way to do things. We should have companies operating at scale, building out coverage into rural areas as best they can. It's better to do that at scale than to hamstring providers to have individual small companies in each pocket of rural America.
All right, well, thank you.
I'm sorry, I just have to interject here if I can have permission.
I got to move on because I'm limited on my time. Mr. Ledger indicated in his testimony in 2012, CWA claimed that the T-Mobile Metro PCS merger would destroy 10,000 jobs when that merger actually generated 12,000 new jobs following the transaction. So, Mr. Shelton, why should we believe CWA's claims that the current merger will result in 30,000 job losses, which incidentally exceeds Sprint's entire employee headcount?
Well, in the first instance, we were concerned about call center jobs because T-Mobile had just shut down 7 U.S. call centers in the U.S., laying off 3,300 people and sending the work to the Philippines. Metro PCS outsourced its entire call center operation. If T-Mobile adopted Metro PCS's outsourcing model, then 10,000 T-Mobile call center workers' jobs were at risk at the time.
Okay, my time has expired, so let me ask Mr. Ledger real quick if the chairman will indulge. You want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I think what my colleague was attempting to explain is why his estimates were wrong, and it didn't take place. I would also just like to submit that the CWA predicted that the AT&T T-Mobile transaction that was disapproved would add 96,000 jobs. So I know what my business plan is, and I'm very clear jobs will be created.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing to help us better understand these very complex issues. As for me, I'm particularly interested in how the T-Mobile Sprint merger will affect market for low-income consumers with poor credit. The services you provide are absolutely essential, and if vulnerable communities end up with reduced access, this merger will have profoundly harmful effects. That is why I would like to talk about what this merger would mean for the prepaid market. Now, Mr. Brandbrook, did I say that right?
Close enough, sir.
Thank you. In your testimony, you discussed the effects of this merger on these customers, that is again, the prepaid mobile market. Can you expand upon what this merger means for this customer base in terms of choice and price?
Yes, sir, and that's an important question. The prepaid market is, right now it has about 97 million subscribers. I think that was the number at the end of 2017. And those nearly 100 million people are more likely to be people who are low income, people who mobile is their only connection. They might not have a fixed broadband connection at home because it's too expensive. They're more likely to be young people or persons of color who maybe have bad credit or no credit. This market drastically consolidates that marketplace. The HHI numbers that we talked about with the antitrust review are even higher for the prepaid marketplace, which means that the combined Sprint and T-Mobile in a duopoly market where only AT&T is there is going to have the power and the incentives to raise prices on those consumers. Consumers who, frankly, are reliant on that mobile connection and have nowhere else to go.
Now, Mr. Ledger, you have suggested that the prepaid market would benefit from the merger and even made commitments to the FCC not to raise rates for these plans for 3 years. And we've already heard arguments that the spirit of those commitments may not really bind you in practice. I assume you are making this commitment in good faith, but business plans change. How can we be sure prices will not increase, especially for low-income Americans? For instance, could consumers take you to court?
Thank you very much, sir. This whole topic is one that's extremely important. And what I have attempted to do, and what T-Mobile has been successful in doing, is blurring the lines between what's called postpaid and prepaid, such that it's almost a payment term. Do you pay on the first of the month or the last of the month? so that prepaid customers are not getting lesser capabilities or quality or data than previously. We're very proud that we are a large provider, second behind billionaire-backed TracFone in serving the prepaid market. And that's very important to us. And our track record is that our prepaid customers over the last 5 years have had a 4% decline in price, a 12 times increase in data. And I've implemented plans, by the way, to allow prepaid customers to create their own credit by their payment history with T-Mobile as opposed to their other forces, and use that as a way if they choose to move to postpaid. And I have a migration of about 150,000 customers a quarter going from prepaid to postpaid very proudly, and that will continue.
Mr. Barronbrook, I'd like to give you the last word with my remaining time. Can you speak to Mr. Ledger's comments that he just made?
Yeah, I guess I didn't know if there was a commitment there or a promise. But you know, I think what the committee and I think what the Department of Justice and FCC should be looking at with this marketplace is, are prices likely to go up? Does the combined firm and the other players left in the prepaid market have the power and have the incentives to raise prices? And when you constrict this marketplace down to two facilities-based providers, new T-Mobile and AT&T, that is clear and evident. A duopoly market will result in higher prices for the people in the prepaid market who can at least afford to pay those higher prices.
Sir, could I just emphasize the last point? I want to be very clear in any which way you would like to ask the question. Prices will go down. Unit cost prices will go down. Absolute prices will go down. And the pricing commitment that I inserted on February 4th, I believe was the date, was not in response to a negative review process. It was an attempt to add another layer in addition to my business plan that says, if you were concerned whether there was any trickery, let me be clear. The rate plans will stay in place, and customers that pay X today will not pay more. And that was a very clear attempt that I made.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. LaHour, in my district, T-Mobile has a call center that employs nearly 1,000 employees. Since it opened in 2006, it has shown continuous improvement in employee retention and performance. And in 2006 and 2007, it was ranked #1 by 417 magazine as the best place to work in Springfield, Missouri, my hometown. Can you talk about the new T-Mobile commitment of at least 600 new retail stores, 5 new customer experience centers, and 11,000 new employees on the ground in rural areas and small towns, communities that need them most? What effect will this merger have on jobs in my district?
Thank you, sir. I'm very proud of the fact that a core component of the Un-carrier and T-Mobile was even changing the definition of what is a call center, away from IVRs and robotic responses, and taking and empowering those people, like in Springfield, Missouri, to own personally customers, called Team of Experts. And what I'm doing with the merger is I'm creating 5 new gigantic centers to deploy a team of experts across what's going to happen with Sprint. So there'll be 5 major centers with 5,600 new employees. The existing centers will expand by 2,000 employees, meaning just in that area, 7,600 jobs. Of the increase in jobs at T-Mobile, rural America will disproportionately benefit. There'll be 600 new retail stores, 5,000 jobs. About 11,800 of the people that will do the integration and network deployment will be heavily in rural America. And so there'll be 5,000 retail jobs, over 7,600 customer care jobs, and thousands of jobs on network integration, heavily all in rural America.
Thank you. And Mr. Clawray, should we be concerned that these two companies, once merged, would hold a significant share of the prepaid market?
Even after the companies are combined, market share will only be 38%. And the biggest beneficiaries will be those prepaid customers that are going to have the same access today to the great network that we're going to go build. So we believe we've been very clear that everybody's going to be benefit from this merger, whether you're prepaid, whether you're postpaid. Sprint has a long history of serving all prepaid customers, all the way down to Lifeline, two or different brands that we have, Boost and Virgin. And we've decided that we're basically going to keep all the brands, so therefore we're going to continue to up the ante in the prepaid ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Bennett, if you came down to Branson, Missouri, and you went to the corner of Commercial Street in Maine, and on each corner there were different folks with carts selling Gala apples. Apple Company 1, 2, 3, and 4 selling edible apples. And one of those companies got to talking to the other one on a smoke break and said, hey, you know, we could combine and we could, you know, figure out how to grow more apples at less money, save on trucking expenses, bring them to the market at a smaller fee. Do you think combining those two companies would affect the price of apples on that corner? Can you turn your mic on there, please, and pull it up a little bit?
Since we're talking apples, I don't think that would have an effect on the market because they're all the same.
Okay, and
But the difference here is we're talking wireless, and we're talking about wireless in rural America, where both of these companies have had over 20 years to build out to rural America. And Sprint chose a path of working with carriers. Mr. Brake over here just said, oh, that's a bad path to choose. Let's just eliminate all the rural carriers. There is your nail on the head on the antitrust concerns about here. These two companies have worked to, if they're combined together, we're going to have the new T-Mobile with Mr. Legere sitting at the head, who has not made one iota to build out to rural America. I don't even know if Mr. Legere has been to rural America, but it's a very hard road to hoe, as you know, with your rural constituents. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of fiber.
The four companies that are competing together, regardless of the product that they're selling, if one of those combined with the other, you think that prices for their product would necessarily go up?
If we're talking apples and they're all the same.
No, I didn't say we're talking
Your
apples.
example
I
was
moved on.
apples.
I
Yes,
said
I
we're
think
talking about selling
the prices are going to
same
go up
product.
because I think they're motivated to put other companies out of business, other small companies, and that's just what I
So
heard
you think
Mr.
prices
Brake
would
say.
go up then if the two
I
of them
think prices
combined?
will go up, yes.
Okay, now what if one of those companies just said, this deal of selling whatever that service or product is that's of equal value, maybe not apples, but whatever that is, what if they said, this is not as much fun as it used to be, you know, the competition's knocked us out, we're not making the profits, you know, for a shareholder, we're going to go out of business.
I think there's a
If
lot
they
of
went away, do you think that, let me finish my question if you would, do you think that that would also increase prices, or would that lower prices if one of those three merchants went away? Four merchants, I'm sorry.
I think that others will step in.
Okay,
and
my
sell the
time's
apples.
expired, I yield back, thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all understand this is a complex decision, which is why I thank all of you for being here today. We're dealing with various interests like workers and consumers, advancing technology like 5G and broadband, rates and competition. And I think overall, my broadest concern is, will this merger create a synergy? Will the ultimate proposed company be greater than the sum of its parts, or will it not? Mr. Ledger, first, you know, your company has a reputation of being a disruptor, and that's a good thing. But it also draws concerns about whether that would continue, obviously. We applaud your promise to have no rate increases for 3 years and have each worker have an opportunity to work somewhere else in the company. Would you all also agree to have that as a condition of approval of the merger by the federal government?
Could you repeat the commitment, sir?
There were commitments that there would be no job losses and that rates wouldn't go up for 3 years. And I was wondering if you all would be in agreement with that being a condition of approval of the merger.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. All of my submissions of 24 million pages of documentation to the DOJ, as well as all the work with the FCC, makes it very clear that I'm committing to prices declining and jobs increasing, and I'll make those commitments in any fashion that's necessary. If I could real quickly point out that I spend a significant time in my life in rural America, as all of my employees around the country would
Thank you, Mr. Ledger. I'm sorry, my time is limited, but I appreciate that. Mr. Claude, would you also agree that to these promises as a condition of approval of a merger by the federal government?
Mr. Ledger is going to be the CEO running the company, but what I can tell you is before agreeing to merger companies, We've had lengthy discussion in terms of how important it's going to be to increase the number of jobs and to bring prices down. If we try to keep this extremely factual, we are going to increase our capacity by 8 times. There's no other way to do it, bringing new customers, than to lowering prices.
Thank you, Mr. Claude. So I accept those as both yeses then. Thank you for that. And Mr. Shelton, can you go into what the current wages right now are at both Sprint and at T-Mobile versus other carriers, and what your opinion is as far as how the merger would affect those wages?
Since we don't represent either Sprint or T-Mobile, I don't exactly know what the wages are in either of those companies, but I do know that when you decrease competition for labor, wage rates are going down no matter what you do. And the other problem that this merger would create is that by the company's own admission, there's $43 billion in synergies here. And to me, synergies is a word that has a synonym called job cuts. And if there's $43 billion in job cuts, you're going to decrease competition for labor, or increase competition for labor, and therefore wages are going down. And they're not only going down in T-Mobile and Sprint, but they're going down in every wireless carrier in the country.
Sir, could I provide some facts to this discussion?
I assume that you disagree with that.
There's a significant absence of facts. I can tell you that the average wages of a retail employee at T-Mobile are approximately $50,000 a year. A customer care person makes about $46,000 a year. Every single employee receives stock grants every year as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ledger. Thank you for that, and that is important.
And the synergies are not in jobs.
Thank you for getting that on the record, too. I want to end with Mr. Baron Brock. There's a public interest analysis that's done by the FCC. Obviously, we're here in oversight of the FCC. Do you have any opinions on how this would score, and any predictions on the FCC's review of this potential merger?
Sure, and thank you for the question. So, as you know, the FCC's analysis is different from the Department of Justice's. They both look at competition harms to consumers, antitrust type issues. The FCC also looks at issues like, will Americans continue to have access to...
If we could get to it, how do you think it'll score? What's your prediction?
I think this merger has many of the same harmful characteristics, if not more, as the rejected AT&T T-Mobile merger in 2011.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your opinions.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel for joining us for today's hearing. Mr. Ledger, would you repeat the comments you made about the use of Huawei and ZTE technology in your opening statements? For
Yes,
the record?
sir. There is no Huawei or ZTE equipment in the network of T-Mobile. There will not be any. We will not be using any. In fact, we've had a litigious relationship with them, and we are, frankly, very supportive of the United States government's increased action.
Glad to hear that. I spent 30 years of my life in business before I did this, and 20 years of that was as a C-level person in companies. And a big part of my portfolio had to do with M&A. And I had to look at every transaction as if there were only 2 outcomes, because that's really the truth. Either you're going to merge or you're not. The acquisition is going to happen or it's not. So we've had a lot of comments from the panel today about what happens if we do this, both some good, some bad. What happens if it doesn't happen? So, Mr. Ledger, you'd spend about a minute to talk about the impact on T-Mobile's customers and employees and stakeholders if the merger doesn't happen. Mr. Claude, we're going to go to you next, and Mr. Brake, we're going to ask you about the wireless ecosystem at large if the merger doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll try to be brief and pass to Mr. Claret. I will not be able to, and the United States will not be able to, enable its promise on building a world-leading 5G network. What we will create and Sprint will create along with AT&T and Verizon will be inferior to what's being created in China and in South Korea. That will lead to loss of jobs and economic impact in the country. I will not have the supply or the capacity to continue to supercharge the Un-carrier. I'll be able to move forward, but not in the same fashion creating competition. I will have limited, if no ability, to expand into the in-home broadband and provide Comcast and Charter the competition that they need.
Okay. Mr. Clary, could you talk about Sprint's, if the merger fails, the impact on Sprint's customers, employees, and stakeholders?
Great, thank you. One of the things that's important to reiterate is today we live in a duopoly, and you were a businessman, and you know that if the duopoly, AT&T and Verizon, control over 93% of the cash flow that is generated, it is impossible to compete, it is impossible to invest. So Sprint ain't going away, but what Sprint is going to be a very different type of company. It is going to be one that we can only invest in the traditional urban and suburban, and we will bring a limited 5G. Unfortunately, as you know, Sprint doesn't generate any cash flow. And if we got to build this network on our own, we need to spend between $20 to $25 billion. We're going to have to go to the banks, we're going to have to go to the bond markets, and we're going to have to borrow that money. In order for us to pay back the investment in 5G, unfortunately, Sprint is no longer going to be able to be the price leader. Prices will go up. And I'm going to reiterate one thing that we don't talk enough. 93% of the cash flow in this industry is being generated by AT&T and Verizon. That is exactly what as close to a monopoly or duopoly is in this country.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Clary. Mr. Brake, if the merger fails, what's the impact on the wireless ecosystem writ large?
Sure. Of course, there will be a number of different impacts, but to my mind, one of the most important impacts is you'll see a much slower, more gradual transition to a 5G network. One of the main reasons to support this merger is the synergistic spectrum that both T-Mobile and Sprint would combine. The low-band spectrum and the mid-band spectrum bring together coverage as well as capacity. Sprint, with the limited cash flow, is unlikely to be able to deploy a 5G network at this scale that would be needed to get the capacity, the coverage out of the mid-band spectrum. There's limited propagation. And the FCC is trying to bring mid-band spectrum available to market that T-Mobile may have the resources to acquire, but that would be years down the road and would take a much longer process. I could talk for a while about the benefits of 5G and why that is so important. It's anticipated to be a very flexible, adaptable network, right? That isn't just about phones, but it's about integrating with business and the broader economy writ large. So it is, I think, a strong national interest to make an accelerated transition to 5G. This combination is the most obvious, fastest way to get a good combination of spectrum to see a really robust 5G network.
Thank you for your responses. Ms. Chairman, I'm going to give you back 15 seconds.
Thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes my good friend from California, Ms. Eshu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the all of the witnesses for not being able to hear all of your testimony, but I did review it. We have another very important subcommittee that's meeting upstairs, and I chair that, and that's the reason I wasn't here, but I am now. I want to use my time to, not to ask questions, but to make a statement. And again, thank you for appearing, all of you, and for the testimony that you've submitted. I've had the opportunity to meet with various stakeholders, speaking to them and listening to them, both pro and con, about this merger. I've given a lot of thought to it, and as I said, I want to use this time to state my position. Since I first joined this subcommittee in 1995, only 5 minutes ago, my work has been guided by two overarching priorities: to create and maintain healthy competition in our country and to protect consumers. Capitalism doesn't work without competition, and when markets don't work, consumers are the first to lose. Competition is the lifeblood of our economy. It stimulates innovation, something that my district produces a great deal of, and it benefits consumers with more choices, lower prices, and better service. Today, the top two wireless carriers in America control approximately 2/3 of the market. They had roughly the same market share 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 years ago. So this is hardly a competitive, dynamic market that we have. For all intents and purposes, we have a duopoly in the country. Americans pay some of the highest prices for mobile wireless service in the developed world. They have fewer choices when it comes to providers, and the quality of service, particularly in rural America, leaves a great deal to be desired. Both Sprint and T-Mobile challenged AT&T and Verizon in recent years, and they have fought tooth and nail to gain market share while adopting pro-consumer policies that have forced real change in the industry. I heard the chairman's opening statement, and he detailed that, I think, very well. I admire and respect what they've been able to do, but both companies are missing crucial ingredients to become heavyweight competitors in the market. T-Mobile has a strong track record as an aggressive competitor. That, I think, we can all stipulate to. But the company lacks critical mid-band spectrum to provide the network capacity it needs to compete more aggressively with the top two. And that's where Sprint comes in. Spectrum is gold, and Sprint has it. But Sprint has something else. They have a $40 billion debt that they're carrying, and they can't make the kind of investments that are necessary to build out a network and compete with the top two carriers. Sprint's debt, I think, is unsustainable, and I think it's difficult to stay afloat while carrying it. It really holds one back, to say the least. Now imagine if they go out of business, if they go bankrupt. This outcome would clearly, I think, be worse for the market, for employees, for consumers, and I can just picture the chairman of the FCC allowing the spectrum to go to the duopoly. So that's not a pretty picture either. I think it's something that we all need to consider. Some have argued that consolidating the current market from 4 carriers to 3 will increase prices and harm consumers. I think this argument assumes that the new company will not compete to lure new customers away from its competitors. It just doesn't make sense. In reality, I think the merger will increase the new company's network capacity 8-fold. New T-Mobile will have the resources and the capacity to grow its subscriber base, and to do so, it will need to aggressively compete. Not going to sit. Why would someone buy and then sit on their oars and not try to attract new customers? So some have raised concerns that the merger will harm low-income consumers. The companies have sworn under oath and made commitments to continue participating in the Lifeline program that I have fought so hard for, and will keep prices low in the prepaid market. So I have more in my statement, Mr. Chairman, but I think that each call center, all call centers are going to be coming back to the United States, and new call centers are being added. That means more jobs. I know that one of the biggest rubs for my side of the aisle is that T-Mobile is not union. My personal preference is I wish they were, but they're not. But I think that competition and the protection of consumers is front and center in this, and that's why I support the merger. I thank the chairman for his patience with my overuse of my time. Thank you.
As usual. I thank my
As much
friend.
in as I can.
Chair now yields to Ms. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. I, along with my colleague who could not be here today for obvious reasons, Debbie Dingle, and I just want to extend my sorrow to her and to her state and district, and to those who served with Chairman Dingle. We formed a 5G caucus last Congress. And Congresswoman Dingle and I have certainly been educated and believe that there needs to be significant education in the country about the importance of 5G. And continuing to build on Congresswoman Eshu's comments about the importance of competition. I got the sense, Mr. Brake, and would like, because you were supporting this merger, but before I ask you about 5G, because I think you wanted to talk more about the importance of 5G, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter dated September 17 of 2018 from the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, the Vice President of Environment and Energy Policy, Greg Ellis. Indiana Chamber of Commerce submitted to the FCC a letter of support for this merger. I will say that Indiana, specifically Indianapolis and central Indiana, is the first site in the country to have the build out by AT&T and Verizon of 5G. So we are the only community in the country where that is happening right now. And I find it interesting, and ask unanimous consent to submit this letter to the record, that our Chamber of Commerce is asking for more competition. And they are asking that the FCC adopt the merger and approve of the merger for the new T-Mobile. Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Brake, on behalf of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, can you please talk with us about the importance of 5G? We need to do a better job educating everybody about 5G, and the importance of how 5G, when we have rural communities still at 2G, 3G, 4G, we know there is a growing digital divide, and how important it is that we catch up with Japan, with Korea, with other parts of the globe that are right now beating us in 5G. Can you very briefly talk about the importance of 5G?
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Brooks, for the question, and thank you so much for your leadership with the 5G caucus. We at ITF are in strong agreement. It's an incredibly important issue. So a lot to unpack with 5G. I'll try to be as brief as possible. 5G in its sort of most capacious sense, right? The broadest sense of 5G is best understood simply by the specification, the technology defined by a standard-setting body, international standard-setting body called 3GPP. This new radio standard unlocks a number of different capabilities, but its sort of defining hallmark is its flexibility, its adaptability, right? As I mentioned in my opening statement, this isn't just about faster downloads and more responsive interaction with your phone, though it is that, and that's important, and brings real consumer benefit. But there are a number of ways in which the technology can adapt itself to, for example, can radically simplify communications for IoT devices. So if something only needs to wake up, once a day to send a little, few packets of information about the humidity on a farm or a water main leak or something like that, it can do so while maintaining extremely long battery life measured in the terms of years rather than days. So all this is to say that 5G poses a unique opportunity to see a much greater integration of wireless services with the broader economy, and has the opportunity to greatly increase productivity overall for businesses throughout America. That's why we want to see a quick transition to 5G in a way that's both broad and deep, right? And that's where the specific spectrum combination at play here comes in.
This is going to be revolutionary, what the possibilities of what 5G will bring. And so, Mr. Legere, I think the concern that you have heard about is how will this new network, how will the new T-Mobile help these untapped markets, these underserved areas, the rural areas. I represent both urban, suburban, and rural areas. How can we make it ensure that you're going to get there and that it's going to be more cost effective?
Yeah, thank you for this extremely important topic. And very importantly, one of the reasons the nation is lagging in 5G deployment is that Verizon and AT&T have been stuck in providing millimeter wave in very small geographic areas. And for the promise of 5G to be true, we need all spectrum bands across all of the nation. Think about something like autonomous driving, something where 10 millisecond delay is attained by the 5G networks, and you're actually going to have autonomous driving cars. How would that work if it was only in one small geographic area? T-Mobile and Sprint together are going to be the only full, broad, and deep 5G capability that's nationwide, and that will spur AT&T and Verizon to broaden their views as well.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also apologize for not being here to hear your testimony because I was also on the Health Subcommittee hearing also. But I'm curious, this is a very important topic and it's very important for the future of our country. Now, I understand that Sprint is in the process of deploying massive MIMO radios to utilize its 2.5 gigahertz spectrum and complete the first 5G data transmission on a MIMO radio earlier this year. I realize it's technical, but I'm leading to something here. As you know, Band 41 was included in 3GPP's 5G new radio specification in late 2017. Of course, the benefits of these radios are that they enable both LTE and 5G transmissions simultaneously and are software upgraded to the full 5G. This appears to offer a particularly promising path in the effort to deploy 5G. Mr. Claure, with Sprint already deploying this radio technology, is it necessary for the companies to combine to deliver its next generation offering?
Yes, thank you for your question. The important part when you build a 5G network is you want to be able to combine capacity, which is what a Sprint has through massive MIMO and others, with coverage, which is what a Sprint lacks. It will be no good for a Sprint to offer just 5G in some specific neighborhood of some specific cities. What this is going to allow us to do when we merge with T-Mobile is we're going to be able to have the ultra capacity that you've mentioned combined with T-Mobile's 600 megahertz spectrum that will give us the coverage. So it is necessary, in order for the U.S. to lead in 5G, which is quite necessary for our country, the combination of our two companies, it is the only way that we're going to be able to build a 5G network that basically has capacity all over the U.S.
So what I get from that is that you're definitely going to, Mr. Ledger, adopt this deployment strategy, and the new T-Mobile will leverage these assets in a way that Sprint has not by the combination. Is that correct?
Yeah, very importantly, and thank you for introducing 4x4 MIMO and carrier aggregation and 256 QAM, which are the main characteristics of what AT&T is now falsely calling 5GE. We'll put that in. And one of the big issues with deploying a nationwide broad and deep network is the amount of sites. And between T-Mobile and Sprint, we have an inadequate set of network macro nodes. The biggest improvement here is together we have 110,000 macro nodes. We'll be able to pick 75,000 of them, build 10,000 more, and the decommissioning of 35,000 of those sites is actually going to provide this significant amount of the synergy. When you take that many sites and you get that extra spectrum per site and the spectral efficiency of 5G, that's the magic that unloads the real promise of 5G.
Now, Sprint acquired Nextel Communications in 2005, bringing with it a considerable amount of Band 41 spectrum leases and significant groundwork put into IP-based mobile broadband technologies. And with Sprint's Clearwire acquisition, the mobile broadband technology selected by both companies to leverage the spectrum assets for 4G was WiMAX. However, Sprint began deploying LTE technology on its network in 2011. And the leap from third to fourth generation of mobile internet that WiMAX was supposed to offer by utilizing Sprint's 2.5 gigahertz spectrum assets was not fully realized. Mr. Claure and Mr. Ledger, what lessons do you see as being learned from this effort, and how do those lessons inform your company's 5G strategies?
Thank you for the question. I think Sprint chose the wrong technology. WiMAX was not the right technology. And what makes this merger unique is we're both choosing the exact same technology for 5G. And basically, our complementary spectrum asset is what is going to allow us to go ahead and build the fastest. And we made bold statements. I believe that we have a chance to build the world's best 5G network, as simple as combining the two spectrums that we have.
Congressman, I could just add, with all the great work that T-Mobile has done, I think it points out that when these generational shifts take place in wireless, whether it was 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G, with all the great work we've done, a big enabler of our ability to deploy 5G happened to be the spectrum and the cash that came to T-Mobile from the failed AT&T merger, as well as the acquisition of Metro PCS and the utilization of their capabilities. So it does take the kind of things that we're able to do in this merger to provide that complementary spectrum, as well as the financing and the assets that we don't individually have.
Okay. Thank you, and I ran out of time. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Okay, let's see, who's left over there? Mr. Wahlberg, you're up for 5 minutes.
I'm looking around and I don't see anybody else, so it's a pretty good pick here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Representing plenty of rural area in my district, this is an important hearing for me, especially as a new member, to get up to speed, maybe up 1G or 2G, let alone 5G. But it's incredibly important to my rural district areas that we not be left behind as carriers move to 5G, but also, probably more importantly, that we get reliable wireless service to begin with in the process. So, Mr. Laguerre, you've talked a lot about the jobs that might result if your transaction were to be approved. Both in your announcement of the new retail stores in rural parts of the country where you hope to expand service, but also to the new customer experience centers. But taking a step back, as you would build out your new network, can you talk a bit more about the cascade of high-skilled jobs that may result, whether it's tower crews, erecting new macro cell sites, or other industries like agriculture and manufacturing that might be fueled by a better connectivity?
Yes, thank you very much, sir, for the question. I would point out that the rural America has been left behind already. It's that divide that we need to cure. I'm very proud of the fact that in the recent broadcast spectrum auction, one of the first times that low-band spectrum was made available, T-Mobile showed up and won the majority of the spectrum and has been deploying 600 and 700 megahertz now to 301 million people in the United States. So we're bridging that basic divide already. Very importantly, CTIA has shown that the advent of 5G will mean 3 million jobs in the United States, $275 billion worth of investment, and $500 billion of economic benefits. So whether they are jobs associated with the impact of utilization of new applications in 5G or the onslaught of the utilization, for example, in rural farming applications, et cetera, there's 3 million jobs that are at stake, and with the deployment of 5G, rural America will benefit the most.
That's important to understand because it's rural America that's catching up and too often left behind in the thought process that we don't need it. I'm looking forward to the first time I have broadband to my house, or cable, or anything to my house. My agricultural industry is way beyond now what the capabilities they have available to them in many places. Mr. Clary and Mr. Laguerre, there's been a lot of discussion today about the spectrum bands that would help make new T-Mobile competitive and able to better serve rural America. But Sprint also has a widespread network of wireless assets that would be just as critical for connecting the new network to the backbone and ensuring Michiganders can get wireless broadband access. Can you talk about, both of you, about these wireline components, while maybe not as exciting as the flashy 5G, how will those position your company to expand wireless connectivity to enterprises, customers both small and large?
So thank you for the question. And many times we don't talk enough about wireline, and wireline has been the backbone of our wireless networks. The plan would be us to continue to invest in our wireline network and to continue to be able to compete against Verizon and AT&T, who are even more dominant players in that wireline. And we're going to be able to do that through the different efficiencies that we're going to have in this merger.
Sir, I'll just add, the enterprise business is controlled 90% by AT&T and Verizon. T-Mobile and Sprint have 5% and 4% market share. We're going to add 1,100 jobs into the enterprise space, and we plan to double our market share in the enterprise business. Second part of building out this network, it's a bit of a build it and they will come, and the fiber deployment associated with the backhaul required to build our network has been advancing greatly, and about 86% of our build-out has been covered by that. So those are also good opportunities as well.
Thank you. Ms. Bennett, can you describe for me how you plan to compete with the new T-Mobile if the transaction were to be approved? What would happen to your prices, and what would your subscribers' choices look like?
Our member, I haven't talked for so long, I forgot to turn it on.
Yeah, I understand. It's been a while for me, too.
Our members are again concerned. We've been working with T-Mobile for or a form of T-Mobile before Mr. Legere joined. Back when we were trying to do 3G, we tried to work. They had a big meeting. They brought all the carriers in. They said they were going to work with us. They were going to get us equipment discounts, all kinds of things to be a great rural partner. That never came to be. It was another promise they made to us that they broke. Again, that was not on Mr. Legere's watch. It was prior to him. Since he's been on board, we haven't seen them looking to work with us. So the concern is if T-Mobile wants to come out and build out and overbuild any of these rural carriers, then we're there to compete. But for every cell site we've seen T-Mobile put up in a rural market, we've got at least 10 times the number of cell sites. So we live and work in those areas, and I'm sorry that you don't have service in your area. I wish one of my rural carriers was serving out there. I'm betting they don't. But if they did, you would have a gigabit of service. You'd have fiber in the backhaul, you'd have wireless, you'd have 4G, and you'd have the promise of 5G coming. So we would do it if we were there. Unfortunately, we're not everywhere. And I think what T-Mobile probably fails to recognize is it takes a lot of work to build out a rural wireless network. We build out to where maybe only 8 people will use a cell site. I don't think they're going to do that. So,
thanks for extra time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Schrader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good hearing. I appreciate the hearing. Mr. Sheldon, it doesn't seem like you're a big fan of this potential merger going forward. And I guess I have a question. My understanding was that CWA was a big fan of the AT&T T-Mobile merger, which would have consolidated the marketplace much more than what we're talking about here. So why was CWA in favor of one and not this particular merger?
During that merger, we had a written binding commitment for jobs and a binding promise not to interfere with our organizing at the new company. And that's why we were...
Oh, well, okay, I understand that. That was to protect the union workers, but one could argue the consumers might have been terribly disadvantaged with that degree of consolidation. I just put that out there. I appreciate the work you're doing, though, very, very much on behalf of working men and women. I guess for Mr. Legere, T-Mobile has been, especially since your tenure, been very disruptive, in a positive way, very innovative, coming up with new ideas for the marketplace. Once you and Sprint, merge together, you become one of the big three. Obviously there's not a lot of incentive to do that anymore. Can't consumers expect to see less innovation from T-Mobile, the new T-Mobile?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Several pieces. In spite of how innovative we've been and the changes that we've been able to create, we've been unable to crack the share of the top two. They're fighting. We drag them kicking and screaming. But the capacity and the scale and the power of the network that this will give us will really let me take it to them and bring competition in a way it hasn't been seen before. And I'm salivating to take it to the cable players as well. Suffice it to say, if in fact there was ever a fear that there would be a cozy side discussion of the Apple vendors getting together, I'm pretty sure these folks wouldn't speak to me if I was the last person in the room. So that's what this is about, is creating scale and capacity to supercharge this Un-carrier, bring the country to the forefront of 5G, and really drag these duopolists kicking and screaming to what they need to do for the consumer in wireless, rural, as well as let's get into the in-home broadband market as well and make these cable guys start playing also.
Very good. Ms. Bennett, you've talked about the concern about low-income folks, the minorities, people that ostensibly don't have as easy access to internet services, broadband, and the merger could be very detrimental to a lot of those folks that rely on some of the largesse from both Sprint and T-Mobile at this point in time. Question I have is, why are you so concerned about that? But the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators, National Rural Education Association, Puerto Rico Chamber of Commerce, Silicon all think this is a good thing. Why the disparity?
Well, first of all, I've been focusing on the rural carriers' perspective, and we do have low-income folks in rural America that those carriers also serve. It's just a different position. I can't speak to why they are for it. It seems odd to me, and I'll just leave it at that.
It's very fair, very fair. Ms. Laguerre, back to you. While the market share may be small, a lot of the population in different areas seems to be concentrated in the Sprint T-Mobile arena. With the merger, isn't this going to increase consolidation in the marketplace from a pure population standpoint? And how do you respond to that as a problem?
Yeah, well, first of all, the wireless business is a national market. Pricing is national, programs are national, advertising is national. And the share concentration that we have will still, be small compared to AT&T and Verizon, as well as the marketplace for what we're trying to do is broadening. And you need to look at what the cable players are doing, the in-home broadband market, et cetera. So I think there's plenty of room.
All right, very good. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I want to thank the witnesses, of course, for being here today and testifying. Mr. Brake, toward the end of your written testimony, you mentioned costs associated with switching providers and number portability. Over the years, we've all seen the commercials and the cell phone market comparing rates, statistics, and data services. Can you further detail the ease, if it is easy, and costs of switching wireless providers? And do you have any information related to frequency a customer switches providers, whether in the prepaid or postpaid market?
Sure, thank you for the question. Right, so switching costs have historically played a very important role in competition and communications networks. I mean, going far back beyond even the advent of wireless, right? For wired telephone service, number portability played an important role. If you can't bring your own phone number that all of your friends know to a new network, you have little incentive to change costs. So there are a number of different tools that have made those switching costs lower and lower over time that makes it very easy for consumers to change providers. I think an important one going forward is this advent of the so-called eSIM, the electronic SIM card, that allows for consumers to very easily change carriers, and also plays an important role in the important future role in the MVNO market, when virtual providers can change the carrier that their consumers use. It has an important role in maintaining competition in those markets.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Ledger, based on what you've heard, in a post-merger world, if one of your competitors offers a great deal to new subscribers, will new T-Mobile be worried that it will lose users and feel pressure to offer a substantially similar deal to retain consumers in the marketplace?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I want to point out that T-Mobile has been one of the main reasons that customers are able to switch. Amongst the first things that I did was separate the device and the rate plan so that customers would know which was which, eliminate all contracts, and then I instituted the payment called Contract Freedom, where I would pay any cost that would be required if you wanted to leave your carrier. We've also been a strong proponent of eSIM as well, which allows customers to move freely between them. I'm not afraid of any kind of a competition from a standpoint of creating the value that customers would need to switch. And with the capacity that this network will bring and the scale and scope that I'll be able to have and the unit cost, it's highly likely that I'll be the one creating those offers that are going to cause people to think twice.
Thank you. It sounds like there's decent competition within the marketplace. Is that correct? I mean, you just said that, so I'll assume that. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. In closing, like Mr. Walden, I want to acknowledge the process already in place for these types of mergers. The agency review process has been used successfully in the past to approve, conditionally approve, and deny mergers. Like the sought-after mergers before this, I have full faith that the FCC and DOJ thoroughly review all the facts to determine whether it is in the public interest, of course, the merger. Like the witnesses, I await the decision and the reasoning for that conclusion from all the information in the record, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member and our panelists for their testimony here today. Speaking on behalf of my constituents in Brooklyn, New York, they care about creating and keeping good-paying jobs, particularly in New York City. However, they've grown quite wary and cynical of big corporations that seem to rake in money hand over fist while their hardworking neighbors have to pinch pennies to make ends meet or to even afford the corporate offerings that we hear about and that sound so great for the consumer. If T-Mobile and Sprint merge, there's going to be one less employer in this particular labor market. So my question first is to Mr. Shelton. And Mr. Shelton, I'd like to know, if at all, how will losing one additional employer affect the wages of communication workers, even those that don't work for the new T-Mobile?
As I've said before, when you decrease competition for labor, wages go down, and that's what will happen, and it will happen throughout the whole wireless industry if this merger takes place, not only at T-Mobile and Sprint, but also at Verizon and AT&T and any other wireless carrier.
Now, what makes you say that? I mean, currently, you have a baseline of wages. What will less competition do in terms of, particularly those in unionized shops, of impacting on their wages? I think it's important for the public to understand that.
Well, we believe that there'll be a substantially less employees working at T-Mobile Sprint, and therefore you'll be flooding the labor market with people who know the wireless industry and know how to do the job at the wireless industry, at any wireless company. The only one that we really have protections because of collective bargaining is AT&T. So at Verizon and T-Mobile and Sprint, you'll have wages going down.
Okay, Mr. Ledger, would you care to respond to those concerns of
Yeah,
our
thank you very
constituents?
much. And I would say that I've already made my commitments very clear to the state of New York associated with what employment would be and that jobs will be going up after this transaction. Competition is clearly going to go up, and I would actually welcome greatly that you walk around Brooklyn to the many stores and experiences.
They're all in my neighborhood. I'll have to walk, because they're right there.
And I would say you're going to find a very happy, very well-paid, highly compensated group of employees that are extremely excited about this merger in the future.
Well, let me ask another question. Given that Lifeline provides essential service, including mobile broadband service, does the new T-Mobile intend to continue Sprint's existing commitments to Lifeline and other contractual agreements that they have currently engaged in?
Yes, and thank you very much for that opportunity to discuss this, because it's been a question. Very clearly, we are supporting the Lifeline agreements that Sprint has, and frankly, new T-Mobile will have a capability to support Lifeline that old T-Mobile didn't. So I think not only will we support all the agreements, but we'll be a better Lifeline provider than we were before.
Very well. And then I'd like to get a sense from you post-merger, what is the current and future racial and gender composition of your board of directors and executive management team? Can we get that information?
I'd be glad to. Our employees are 62% diverse, but I'd be glad to provide all that.
Looking at particularly the board and management, as well as currently with Sprint, so we can see what this merger does in terms of inclusion and diversity at the leadership level.
Be glad to include that.
Very well.
Congressman,
Mr. Chairman?
Sure. Can I jump in on the Lifeline question very quickly?
Absolutely.
So, as you know, and you've been a champion of the Lifeline program, it's the service that serves the most low-income segment of the population that absolutely needs that subsidy for basic connectivity.
Yeah.
Sprint has been a great partner in the Lifeline program, and you just heard Mr. Leisure fail to make any commitments that new T-Mobile will actually participate in the Lifeline program other than keeping Sprint's current commitments in the Lifeline program. There was no future commitment to Lifeline, and most importantly, Sprint is a wholesale provider to many of the wireless resellers that participate in the Lifeline program and serve 70% of that marketplace. There was no commitment to continue those relationships going forward as well.
Very well. My time is up, but Mr. Leger,
Ms. Clark,
my eyes are on you.
Yeah, my microphone might have been off when I said we will honor all of the Lifeline commitments. We'll be a good provider going forward, and we honor all of the wholesale agreements that are in existence and look forward to extending those.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Vesey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leisure, I wanted to ask you particularly about your economists. They told the FCC that this merger is in the public interest because consumers should be willing to pay more for a better product. And I want to know, will low-income consumers be able to participate in this better product, or will they be forced to endure second-tier service because they cannot pay for the more expensive product?
Appreciate the question, but I don't recall any time I've ever made a statement that customers should pay more for a better product. My whole philosophy has been to pay less and get more, and that is the philosophy of the new T-Mobile as well.
If Sprint becomes your partner on this on this merger and it goes through, one of the areas that I would be interested in learning more about is if Sprint is not willing to make the commitment right now to build out their broadband and all the capacity that they have in that and expand upon that, why would they be willing to do it if there was a merger? Of the investors that play a big part in T-Mobile and Sprint right now, many of them are the same investors. They've invested money in other adventures outside of the cell phone product.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to figure out what is it about this merger that would actually make them want to invest money moving forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good opportunity to clarify, and I won't speak for the pace at which Sprint has invested, but I think Mr. Claret has been clear about the financial limitations that were put upon them. This transaction itself provides the financing that both of us need to do this build-out. And pinnacle to the whole thesis of this merger is an integrated network plan. Tens of millions of pages of documents and models that I've submitted to the DOJ, as well as the FCC, that show how, at the time of merger moving forward, we will fully integrate and build out these networks, and how the $43 billion worth of synergies, $26 billion of which are coming from the network integration, will provide the financing for $40 billion worth of investment in the first 3 years in the 5G network. So the transaction itself is not only the financing, but it's the accelerant of the investment. And it won't be Sprint building out. The new T-Mobile will be doing the integration and the build-out of the network.
The investors have the money right currently now. Why are they not building out that capacity as we speak?
Again, I think we've both been very clear that neither of us have the capital and the financing to do this 5G build-out. We have created a business plan, and we have reviewed it with rating agents, and we do have the ability to finance this through the new T-Mobile's company, as well as the synergies that the deal will provide. And I just want to point out that at some point, synergies were referred to as job losses, and they're not. They're coming in the form of decommissioning of sites, of things that are part of the network integration. So that's the funding mechanism for this transaction.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the distinguished minority whip, Mr. Scalise.
Thank the gentleman.
And second baseman.
Best second baseman in baseball, right? Thank the gentleman from Pittsburgh for yielding. Pirates are represented very well with you, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about this merger, some of the things that could potentially be done to increase the ability for consumers to be able to experience 5G. You look at the growth in the industry and just what we're seeing in terms of more wireless usage, connectivity, the devices that are able to be connected, and of course, you see trillions of megabytes of data being used by Americans, and that number's increasing as people find out more uses. It creates more jobs, creates more opportunity, creates more efficiencies and improvements in people's quality of life, and I do think that's an important point to talk about as Americans use so many more devices and rely on that increased amount of data that they're able to access. It does really improve their lives on a daily basis, just things that I know I'm able to do. You watch how it's able to allow people to do more things and in a much more effective way. I know you've talked about the jobs. I think to me, some of the things that the Department of Justice should be looking at is, if this merger goes through, would it help consumers? Will it help lower costs? Will it create more jobs? And I know you've talked about some of that in your testimony, Mr. Ledger. So if you could first talk about the ability for consumers to have more competition and have access to lower costs for the increased amount of data that they're using.
Thank you very much for the question. There's so much in what you said that's extremely important, including starting 5G. The promise of 5G is 100 times the speeds, 100 times the number of devices that can go on networks, 10 times the improvement in the response time or the delay that's created. Our new T-Mobile will provide 15 times the speed that we have now, up to 450 megabits average speed across the U.S., and users will go from an average of 10 gigs of data usage to 80, while the unit price will go down 87%. And the track record is there, especially with low-income users who have had a price decline and a disproportionate increase. So that's what this transaction with the DOJ heavily is about, showing the network modeling that will take this industry and significantly increase capacity and provide a pricing decline, and because of that network integration, how that will impact consumers, the offers that they have, and the utilization. And that's what the whole transactions review has been about thus far.
Yeah, I think the idea that not only can you see in your case 15 times the speed as well as lower cost, both of those are, I think, something that would be very attractive to consumers who shop around really good for all kind of products, but clearly data plans. You watch the commercials, and the reason there's so many commercials is because there's a competition for consumers, because everybody knows how important it is to be connected. Now, you've talked about an integrated network plan, what these two companies can do to combine the resources that you have. I think hopefully one day, not too long from now, that little circle that you see when you're waiting for something to download will become a relic that the Smithsonian Institute might hold, because people won't have that problem anymore. You'll have to Google that. Well, what are you talking about? I don't know what that circle is you're referring to.
Sure, that will happen as soon as you switch to T-Mobile.
I see you're already well branded. It's a nice opportunity to give a plug for for your products, and again, competition's what made this industry great. When we look at what 5G can mean for consumers, because ultimately that's what we're trying to help make sure that consumers can have an even better experience. All this is coming from private investment. And, this isn't government that's spending billions of dollars to build out these networks. It's companies like yours and other companies. And, we know all the other players in this space. But, here we're talking about this, this potential merger, and how, I know what you talked about is how you can make those synergies work to provide an even faster experience and help you invest billions more to build that 5G network. Let's talk now about the jobs side of it. And I've heard numbers like 10,000 new jobs referenced. What kind of jobs are you talking about? I know I want to get into spectrum and some other things, but I'm not going to have enough time to get into all of that. Maybe for the record later, if you can let me know about some of the combined spectrum assets of the companies and how that would be good for more innovation and opportunities. But on the job side, if you could touch on that as my last question.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. We've talked a bit today about customer experience centers, which are one of the core jobs in our company now. There'll be 5,600 new jobs, 2,000 expanded jobs in that, so about 7,600 in the customer experience centers. And those are good paying $45,000, $50,000 wage jobs. There'll be about 11,800 people involved in network integration and deployment. There'll be 5,000 people in new retail stores, especially in rural America, and there'll be about 11,000 jobs created over the period for the new businesses we're going in, Internet of Things, video, broadband, et cetera, businesses that we aren't in now. So those are the key growth areas of new jobs.
Thanks, Mr. Ledger. Appreciate your testimony. Thanks for your discretion, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlemen. Chair now yields to Mr. Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I appreciate the conversation today about 5G and what it'll mean for our economy and our future, however, unfortunately, too many people where I live in a very rural state, my district's 47,000 square miles. It takes 8.5 hours to drive across it. I have better connectivity over the state of New Mexico in many cases when I'm on an airplane than when I'm on the ground. I don't understand that. There's a promise now that 5G is going to answer this problem for people like me that live in rural America. And that's where my questioning concentrates. As Mr. Baron Boric, did I pronounce that correct, sir?
Close enough, sir.
Pronounce it correctly for me.
Baron Broik.
Baron Broik notes in his testimony, this gap exists because low population density and high per consumer costs means that rural areas have historically lacked the economies of scale needed to attract strong investment from major carriers. Mr. Leger, in your testimony, you insist that a merger will allow you to, quote, close the gaps in rural broadband access and increase outdoor wireless coverage to reach 59.4 million rural residents, or 95.8% of the estimated 62 million rural residents. Mr. Leger, first, yes or no, do you agree with Phil's diagnosis of why rural communities have been left behind?
I apologize, I'm not sure what the diagnosis was.
The gap exists because low population density and high per consumer costs means that rural areas have historically lacked the economies of scale needed to attract strong investment.
I would submit that that is an analysis that had to have done by those that had the low-band spectrum to cover those communities, which was AT&T and Verizon at the time. Right now that we have nationwide low-band spectrum, we're deploying quickly across all of rural America, and it is our hope to cover every square inch.
So do you agree with Phil's assessment?
I guess. Sorry.
I'm going to say yes.
I'll make that a yes, sir.
Second, yes or no, would you agree that the merger's stated benefits to rural Americans are an important aspect of whether it should be approved?
Yes.
Then help me quickly understand how this merger specifically incentivizes this proposed new T-Mobile to better serve rural communities, and when can my constituents expect to enjoy the wonders of 5G connectivity?
Thank you very much, sir. And yes, the rural divide is extremely important for us. One of the things that's very clear in the output of the models associated with the new T-Mobile is the deployment of the 5G capability will have a penetration across the country where 90% of every person in America will have greater than 100 megabits speed and capacity by 2024. And I can break that down by rural community and any different part of the country.
So what I'll do is I'll submit some questions for the record. Here's the question that I have is that T-Mobile's Chief Technology Officer, Neville Ray, states in an article CNET authored February 6th, Mr. Chairman, that I'd ask unanimous consent to submit to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
What Neville says is that we wouldn't go after 5G millimeter wave deployment in rural America. So help me understand what this comment means. Will my constituents not enjoy the same speeds as people living in urban and suburban communities?
That's a very good point, sir. And I would point out that that's probably more of a condemnation on the Verizon and AT&T deployment of 5G only in millimeter wave spectrum, because the analysis would show that in order to use only millimeter wave to make a nationwide coverage, you would need a site every 1,000 yards, which would cost $1.5 trillion. So in order to deploy 5G nationwide, you need to use millimeter wave, mid-band, and low-band across all frequencies so you have full geographic coverage. Nobody could cover the United States with millimeter wave spectrum. What's likely to happen is millimeter wave will be used in some densely populated urban areas and then enhanced with mid-band and low-band 5G coverage to make a broadband capability nationwide.
So the concern that I have is we also don't have robust fiber in many parts of rural America, and that's where I point my question back to Phil to give you a chance to respond. I noticed your testimony, you discussed how 5G networks will need backhaul support from fixed broadband networks. Does anything about this merger address that need?
Congressman, it's a perfect question. That's absolutely right. For 5G, especially for 5G that, we're talking about to get the full benefits of 5G that Mr. Brake has walked us through, you essentially need fiber backhaul everywhere to connect to those cell sites and towers. The companies don't actually bring those assets to the table. They need to lease those assets, which that is not a merger-specific necessity. They can lease those assets today. And T-Mobile, has gone out in the marketplace and acquired 600 megahertz spectrum. Kudos to them for winning that spectrum at auction, and they've started to deploy it. They're making the case that their 5G deployment in rural America is based on that 600 megahertz spectrum. Those are assets they already have. That is not a merger-specific benefit of this deal.
And Mr. Chairman, I know my time's expired, but as a former regulator, details matter. And when I'm told that rural America is going to get these assets and things don't exactly add up, I have a lot more questions. And so I appreciate the importance of this hearing, Mr. Chairman. There's some important aspects that we need some answers to associated with the commitments with mapping and looking at rural deployment. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for bringing this important hearing before the public. Mr. Legier, I understand you've made commitments to continuing the Lifeline program. You used the word "I will honor" just a few minutes ago. T-Mobile began withdrawing from the program in 2014 and no longer provides Lifeline services today. This service is extremely important where connectivity is basically required to survive, both economically and when it comes to safety and education, et cetera. What's your commitment to Lifeline, and how long do you intend to continue offering Lifeline services should this merger go through? And when you say you will honor, are you talking about the current CEO, Leger, or are you talking about the new T-Mobile will commit to that in writing and make it real beyond your tenure?
The person and the new T-Mobile will put in writing and commit to honoring the Lifeline agreements that Sprint through Assurance has. And I would point out that T-Mobile didn't withdraw from the Lifeline market. We moved to being a wholesale provider of it. But yes, the commitment is from the new T-Mobile, and very willing to put it into any form.
Well, thank you for clarifying. I wouldn't want to mischaracterize your business practices, but when you look at Mr. Claure, his Sprint is more robustly involved in the Lifeline program. What I would love to see is a future, if this merger goes through, a future organization, the new T-Mobile, as some people are calling it, to actually be more like Sprint. So, Mr. Claure, what would the new T-Mobile have to do in order to adopt and expand on what you've been able to do with your company?
Thank you for the question. The new T-Mobile has made a commitment, and they've done it in writing, and we've taken one step above what was required from us, and that is make a voluntary filing to the FCC that includes Lifeline. Nobody asked us to do that. We thought it was the right thing to do to take one step.
On that point, is the new T-Mobile willing to do exactly what Mr. Claure just described? Should this merger go through?
Let me add one quick thing, and that is, we always got to look at, yes, Mr. Leger is the CEO, and there will be a new T-Mobile, but what is important to know is the new network we're going to build is going to have 8 times the capacity that we have today. So therefore, we have an economic incentive to bring as many customers as we can, whether they're Lifeline, whether they're prepaid, or they're postpaid. So yes, we make commitments, but in addition, we have an incentive to do that just to fulfill our business plan.
Now, my question to you, Mr. Legier, about following suit with what Sprint has done to actually file a commitment in writing. Is the new T-Mobile ready to do that?
Yeah, just the clarification, sir. It was me that made the filing on behalf of the new T-Mobile. And I want to reiterate, we're merging with Sprint. Sprint's not going away. So all of the good characteristics and behaviors of Sprint, we're adopting into the new T-Mobile, and this is one of them. And I will make the commitment in Lifeline in whatever form is needed.
Mr. Barenbroek, are you familiar with that submission in writing that they're referring to?
Yes, sir, I am.
Is it what I seem to be describing, or is it a little bit less nuanced than that? And is it, what is it?
It's heavily caveated,
There you go.
sir. And, like many of the commitments that we've seen here today, I think, Congresswoman Clark asked questions about Lifeline too, and the commitments were to honor existing commitments. There were no commitments to honor participation in the Lifeline program as the combined company going forward. Ms. Bennett has spoken about the high cost likely going up for roaming partners and in the MVNO market. That is a huge problem for Lifeline subscribers who may see costs go up and the commitments of these companies go down. Those issues all do need to be explored.
And another thing, look, Mr. Legier, I've heard a lot of wonderful things about you and how you've really changed in a positive way T-Mobile. I commend you for that, American business. Also, Mr. Claude, I followed your career as well. One of you guys wears tennis shoes, the other guys wear hard shoes to work. Apparently the tennis shoes guy is gonna stick around as a CEO, likely, and then the hard shoes guy is going to probably remain on the board because of the shares that Sprint has or what have you. But what I've found when it comes to Lifeline specifically, I like the hard shoes guy and what he's been doing as CEO rather than the tennis shoes guy. So what are we gonna expect to see from the new T-Mobile when it comes to really adhering to this opportunity when you very clearly pointed out the market share opportunity for the new T-Mobile is going to be amazing, especially when it comes to your positioning to be able to provide 5G, which is the future of any provider.
Yes, sir, I can only reiterate the new T-Mobile's commitment to Lifeline, and I will follow up in any form necessary after this hearing to make sure that that commitment is clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Chair recognizes Mr. Welsh.
Thank you for the hearing, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to make a few comments that express what I consider to be major concerns about rural America. We do not have good coverage in Vermont. And the assertion that both gentlemen are making is that this will be tremendous for rural America. I'd like to believe that's true, but I have an apprehension that it won't necessarily occur. Last February, Congress passed and the President signed some bipartisan legislation that I worked on with David Young, improving rural call quality. And it turned out that shortly after that bill became law, T-Mobile and Sprint, the FCC announced that T-Mobile agreed to pay $40 million in a fine for violating FCC rules with a practice of faking ringtones. I mean, this is a big deal for us in Vermont. Dakin Farms in the Christmas season depends on those calls. Camel's Hump School, it gets the word out that it's been canceled because of weather. And in the settlement, T-Mobile acknowledged it had injected false ringtones in hundreds of millions of calls. I mean, that's really upsetting to us. And I'm struggling to see how this past gives me confidence about the future. So, Mr. Legier, can you explain how T-Mobile did fail to abide by the basic call quality standards and not connecting hundreds of millions of calls in rural America, but very briefly, because we don't have much time?
Yeah, sorry, the details associated with a settlement associated with that action are far more complex, and I'm not sure we could go into the process.
Well, maybe offline we could do that, because that's incredible. What is you're admitting to, T-Mobile admitted to, was that it actually had the system.
Yeah, there was
false ringtones.
No admission to a willingness participation in any kind of fraud.
I mean, you and I both know that's sort of the deal, but it happened. And then this brings me to my point about wireless coverage, and I'm a little skeptical about the deployment promises in rural areas. Mr. Chairman, we've got a map of T-Mobile coverage in Vermont. It looks pretty good. It's pretty much the whole state. But the Burlington Free Press had somebody get in a car and travel the roads, the main roads, for 6,000 miles and take signal coverage over 6 weeks this fall. And as I mentioned, it was only on the main roads, and it was covering about 65% of the buildings in Vermont. And its results contradict many of what the assertions that are made by T-Mobile and Sprint. The data on T-Mobile and Sprint, T-Mobile covers 22% of the area tested in the state with 5 megabits per second or greater speed. T-Mobile has no service or spotty service in 62% of the areas. Sprint has no service or spotty service in 50% of the areas. And when I sit here and hear what I believe is your sincere goal to serve rural America and bring 5G to rural America, in a lot of Vermont, we have no G. And these maps don't correspond to what the Burlington Free Press found. So I'm a skeptic, all right? And I guess I'm going to ask both of you, Mr. Legere and Mr. Claure, when you use your maps, you're saying it's 96% coverage. These maps are bogus. I mean, they just don't work. So are you going to redo your mapping so that what we're talking about is apples and not apples and oranges, briefly?
Thank you. I'll take the answer. Today, Sprint has a very limited coverage, and we rely mainly on AT&T and Verizon to be our roaming partners outside our core zone. So we're basically replicating what the maps of AT&T and Verizon.
Well, they're no good.
What's that?
These are no good. These are phony maps.
But the problem that we have today is a very serious problem. The two spectrum holders have been AT&T and Verizon, and they have failed to serve rural America. The commitment that we're making is to build a nationwide coverage, because we just got 600 megahertz just a couple of years ago, and we're going to deploy it as fast as we can.
Well, I mean, if you were sitting where I am and getting the calls I'm getting from Vermonters who have a map that says they've got fantastic service and they can't get a dial tone, you'd share my skepticism. This is a big deal.
Sir, your concerns are very real, and the commitments and the filings that we've made are about the network we'll create, and we have a strong commitment to cover rural America.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record these documents I referred to.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield back.
And now, we come to our final witness, Mr. O'Halloran. You got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I didn't make it on time today. I had a commitment the other side of town. But, boy, I've sat here through this hearing and listened intently on issues about rural America. And I have heard time and time again that they'll be treated differently from now on. That doesn't seem to be the case. They're still going to be at the low end of the poll. They're going to be down there with lack of ability to compete, lack of ability to make sure the families of rural America have the health care necessary through telemedicine, the need for our businesses to be able to expand and economic development to expand. And all of a sudden, we're back to the same old thing. We're back to the cities and everybody else getting the higher amount of coverage than rural America. That's unacceptable. I have a map just like the gentleman from Vermont had, and I travel, my district's 58,000 square miles. Half the time, that map says I should be covered. Half the time, I'm not, by anybody. And so there's a lot of work to do. And what I've also heard today are semi-commitments. You know, we're looking into it. I mean, I've also heard that it's about productivity. Mr. Brake, I understand productivity. I also understand the needs of the citizens of rural America and the needs of the citizens for everywhere to be competitive with the rest of the world. We understand that. But I really am concerned with the type of information I heard today. Mr. Legere, and you've indicated very much that on the Lifeline and Tribal Lifeline program, that are you committed? Are you going to ensure? Or are you going to guarantee that those programs will be completed and stay? And how are you going to do that? What is the plan, the real plan, of how, and be specific as you can.
Yeah, sir, thank you very much, and appreciate your patience. On Lifeline, it's very clear, Sprint is a big provider of Lifeline services, and we will honor their commitments and move forward providing Lifeline in the fashion that they do. And the 5G capabilities that we have will make us an even better Lifeline provider. Second, sir, I would submit to you...
I want to make sure that their commitment, their honor what they do. For how long?
For as long as the contracts are available.
So how long are those contracts available for?
Those are contracts that self-renew, and we have, as part of the merger, we have discussed that the new T-Mobile will basically honor all the commitments and will continue to be a fierce competitor in the Lifeline, the same way that Sprint has been.
So as long as the contracts go, it's not into the extended future, it's just the contract life of that particular contract.
So can we be clear?
And
The new
just a second,
T-Mobile is...
I'm sorry, it's my time.
Okay, sorry, sir.
I just, as somebody that represents tribal nations, 12 of them, as somebody that represents vast amount of towns in rural America, I'm really concerned from what I've heard. And Mr. I'm going to try to get your name right, but I know I'm not going to do it. Breck? No, never mind. What do you anticipate this merger's impacts could be on the tribal Lifeline program? And do you anticipate the FCC and DOJ will meaningfully enforce any conditional commitments made as part of an approval, and anything that we talked about here, if you have comment on that?
Sure, and thank you for the question. This is an important line of question. I'm glad the committee has gotten into this. So, as you know, tribal lands are some of the most underserved areas of the country. Facilities-based providers often provide wholesale service to resellers that serve the tribal Lifeline marketplace. One big concern in this merger that we've talked about here is we're consolidating that that wholesale marketplace under only 3 providers who have fewer incentives to provide low-cost wholesale access. And Carrie, Ms. Bennett has spoken to this a little bit. So what we think that means is the incentives in the marketplace will be to increase the costs that those resellers that those tribal resellers have to pay for Lifeline, those resellers that serve tribal lands pay for Lifeline, driving up the costs in the Lifeline marketplace, potentially driving some of those resellers that serve those communities that you care about out of the market entirely, potentially leaving those consumers without any Lifeline provider.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a final comment, please, shortly? Which is just that with all the concerns about rural America, this transaction is the best path forward for this country to solve the issues of rural America. So I vehemently believe that's the best path forward.
Okay, all time has expired. Send to enter the following documents into the record. A map from CWA of Sprint and T-Mobile's retail distribution for Newark, New Jersey, an op-ed by former Reps Waxman and Tozan, a statement for the record from Consumer Reports, a blog post from Encompass, a report from the Vermont Department of Public Service, a map of T-Mobile's U.S. wireless coverage, a report from the Democracy Reform Task Force, a report by GSA Inspector General, a letter from Representative Cardenas et al. To John Ledger, a letter from the National Diversity Coalition, a letter from CASE, a letter from J. Kenneth Blackwell, a letter from Let Freedom Ring, a letter from Consumers Research, a letter from Americans for Limited Government, a letter from Americans for Tax Reform, a letter to the FCC and DOJ from members of Congress, and last but not least, a letter from coalition members. Without objection, that is so ordered. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing, and I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions you may receive. At this time, the subcommittee is adjourned. Yeah, thanks.